Hello, Avatar fans, and welcome to the next episode of the Avatar Online podcast. This is going to be episode 246 of our regular shows, and we're recording this on June 18th, 2022. This is the official podcast for the fan site AvatarTheLastAirbender.online.com, and I'm going to be your main host, Morgan Airspeed Prime. Joining me on the podcast is Greg2B from the site.
What's up, everyone?
Great. So, on today's show, we have two pieces of news to talk about. They're both actually quite notable, but one has vastly overshadowed the other one. And then we have three episode reviews to get to. So we're going to be reviewing from Korra, K107, The Aftermath. And then from Avatar, we're doing two episodes again. We're going to be doing 109, The Waterbending Scroll, and 110, Jet. So we'll get to them a little bit later on, and we'll jump straight into the news. So we'll start with the lesser piece of news, but it's actually still significant because it's the first information about the game that we found out about that was in development a while ago, and this is the Square Enix London developed Avatar mobile game, which now appears to be called Avatar Generations. So there's a few leaked screenshots that you may or may not be able to find online, depending on how good at searching you are. But a lot of the text information that was put up on Reddit is still out there. So there's stuff like, basically imagine franchise mobile game that you can get for like any other franchise out there, and it looks like they're doing that thing for Avatar. You're going to be able to upgrade your characters with experience scrolls. It does look like a huge part of the game will be basically rolling for gacha characters from Avatar, 4-star, 5-star. I suppose we know what to expect. There's a screenshot that includes like a 7-day logon bonus, and there's a 5-star Iroh unit at the end. There's like the whole summoning system is in here for the gacha rolls, items. It does look like there's the world map that uses like chibi stuff. You'll create a team of 4 units with 1 support unit. And then the actual gameplay does use kind of a 3D model type system, and it looks like you have sort of buttons of attacks that are on like cooldowns. Again, we haven't seen much of this in action, but it looks like it's solid, but nothing fancy based on what you'd expect from mobile games. And then there's one mention that right now it looks like there's only Last Airbender stuff in the game, but there probably will be Korra stuff later on, because it looks like it's going to generally tell the story of Avatar. So I suppose that will just happen as it goes on, and they'll get around to Korra eventually. So we'll talk about the screenshots in a second, but just what are your thoughts on Avatar Generations and what we've heard about it so far?
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is to be expected in terms of what they would produce on the game and sort of the mechanics as you just sort of like outlined there. I mean, if you've seen the images, you can see, it is pretty much what you would expect from sort of this style of game. I mean, I think, it looks good, it looks clean and all that, but I guess it's not sort of sort of like the higher end of mobile games, if that was what you were sort of thinking of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it looks solid, but not like incredible. It looks like the sort of game like I'll probably download this, play it, probably fall off it eventually, and I do not plan to put any money into it whatsoever. This feels like everyone will probably give it a chance just because it's going to be the first like Avatar game that comes out. Because we're going to hear about, I suppose, the other rumored games much later on. But yeah, there's always a little bit of fun in that, like, they always give you like a certain amount of stuff early on. People will download it, play it to see what characters they get, and just be like, oh, that's what this is. Some people will stay and play the whole time, and we'll see what happens from there. At the very least, I guess it will be like a source of potentially like new pieces of like official art, basically, because already from this, it looks like there's maybe like 1 or 2 new pieces of art. Like, I don't remember seeing that Aang before. So that may or may not be new. Similarly, that Iroh, even though it's kind of fairly standard, is different than some of the newer pieces of art that we've seen before. But yeah, you know what it is. There's like 3 or 4 different currencies listed here. Upgrading to make your numbers go up. But if it is kind of expansive with the amount of characters that there are, I can see this being at least somewhat fun. But yeah, we'll have to wait and see. But it's interesting that the game does look like it's kind of well on its way. It's in some sort of like preview phase, of course, where people are actually playing it, where it's actually leaked. So I'm assuming we're probably not too far off it. But I suppose, what are your thoughts on this? Are you gonna even give this game a shot when it comes out?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see a reason why not to give it a shot. Like, I've played, I'm sure many people have played these type of games before, and like, like you said, they hold your attention for a bit, and if you do get invested in it, then, it might be worth it for you. But, generally, you don't want to spend too much of your money on these type of games, just because it can be a bit of a sinkhole if you really get like sort of like that. But I don't know. I mean, the idea of it is okay. It has the basic sort of functions there. It doesn't look like it's like the worst type of game ever or anything like that, like in terms of like the character models from the little bit that we see here. And it seems like from what people have said that they're improving the animation and models as they go on. So, clearly right now it's in sort of like a beta test phase. So, it's probably still not going to come out for quite a bit here. But no, I think it looks okay. I mean, it sort of feels like some of the models that we have from Korra and Avatar that are 3D, but probably like, the later ones in terms of like quality of them. But, it's nothing crazy in terms of that because, it is sort of designated for a mobile game. So it does have limits on what they can actually do with it.
Mm-hmm. But we'll move into the big piece of news here. And it's Avatar Studios news, and it's actually kind of big Avatar Studios news, but there's like a few kind of layers to get through here because of the way that this kind of came out, and then like insider information then came out afterwards to sort of add on top of it, and then we got sort of what felt like just oh yeah, here's basically what they weren't telling you in the first initial kind of post. So this came out of absolutely nowhere. I don't think anyone was actually predicting that we would get news from this event. So it's the Annecy Film Festival, and Paramount were there, and apparently they just came out with this statement in some sort of press release, and I think they said something directly to press as well, as we'll get to. And so this news went all across all of the outlets. So EW, Deadline, Variety, Comic Book Resources, all the major places that would cover this like pop culture news covered this piece of news. And it was basically Avatar will be getting 3 movies. Laura Montgomery is going to be directing the first one. Eric Coleman is back and will, I guess, be an executive producer on said movies. And EW specifically seemed to get a little bit of extra information saying that all 3 films will be separate stories as opposed to a unified trilogy. So that was the information, and it was exciting just because of how widespread it was. But obviously, if you've been following this very closely, very little of that is actually new. Because we knew there was at least 2 movies in development, but realistically that there were at least 3, because we said before, Brian Robbins, or whatever his name is, who works high up at Paramount, said it in like an interview back in September. So we knew that already. We've known since January that Laura Montgomery is a director, and in February we learned that apparently she was the director on the first movie. So that was all fine. So the only new stuff here was direct confirmation of there being a 3rd movie, and the one that no one really was talking about, but that like Eric Coleman is back on Avatar, which is somewhat significant, if not just to have one of the sort of people more involved in the early days of Avatar back involved. So just based on the thing that actually was covered by every outlet, what were your thoughts on this news reveal?
Yeah, I mean, my thoughts were pretty much exactly what you said, is that like I thought we already knew almost all of that. Like most of that, we've talked about it, over and over again at this point on different podcasts. So it didn't really, that part of the news at least didn't really strike me as anything particularly like amazing, other than the fact that I guess it was, being reported on and, eventually went to some other places as well, as I'm sure you'll get to. So the initial sort of like, other than, oh, it was cool, they mentioned something at, this event, it wasn't anything particularly like mind breaking to me, at least not at that point.
Yeah, like the main takeaway from this is just like, hey, they talked about this again in a very public
Yeah.
sense. That's notable. So what happened from there was there was a few little things happened. The first thing that I noticed was that Grace Randolph, who we got some insider information from before to say that one of the two movies at the time was meant to be a prequel movie. That's where that rumor came from. She kind of retweeted the Deadline article covering this and said that I hear one is about Kyoshi, and left it at that. So that was interesting and that was exciting because obviously, we're like, okay, prequel, Kyoshi, that's like two pieces of information that sort of connect together. Avatar News was also agreeing with the whole idea of one of them being a prequel. His sources were saying that as well. So it was kind of like, okay, Kyoshi as close to confirmed at this stage as possible. That's very, very interesting. So when did you hear about the Kyoshi thing? Did you hear from the Avatar News article or did you see this little bit first?
I saw that a little bit first with the other sort of information that they also mentioned at the event as well.
hmm And yeah, then very quickly after that, this news came out from on Twitter here, Raphael Montemayor at Annecy, who is a writer at Slash Film. So he was obviously at the Annecy event, and he just put out this tweet that says, "We got the first piece of concept art for the new Avatar movie from Lauren Montgomery at Annecy Festival. Didn't show much, but it was a shot of what looked like a walled city with a giant tower in the middle, with the caption, 'The Avatar Returns,' and the symbol for Earth." So straight away, this got people talking because obviously here's finally some details. The first ever details about an Avatar studio project that aren't just like the name of a character or like a just blatant rumors. So walled city, giant tower, Avatar Returns, Earth symbol. So immediately people were jumping to like, okay, it's either connected with what Grace Randolph said, and this is some sort of a teaser for Kyoshi, or maybe even like Avatar After Korra. Let's see where they're going with this. What were your thoughts when this news came out?
Yeah, no, that was pretty. I mean, it's nice to hear, and it's I guess a bit fun to react to when you're seeing this. Of course, it doesn't have any sort of like attached, visuals or anything like that, since that wasn't what they're allowed, and I'm sure you'll go into that more in a second here. But I think I don't know. It's always odd when you hear stuff like that and it's just sort of like a random tweet that just sort of gets passed around because these are the people that are at the event, but of course they can only share like a limited amount of information on it, which because they're the press and whatnot.
Yeah, because the other angle on this is like, wait. You put out a news article. You basically put out news to the press that was spread around in all the major outlets, but didn't include the visual, like the most important piece to go along with that. Very, very confusing that you do like an exclusive thing like this. Now people have come out and said, okay, this is the way Annecy works, that like what they show is exclusive, but obviously Paramount, I guess, made the decision to show this to press when they didn't, I suppose, necessarily have to. Now, this was interesting because I think this would immediately make you believe, okay, so I guess they're getting ready to confirm and like come out and actually just say what the projects are, because if they're teasing this to the press, putting out news about it but not giving the details, I guess very quickly, shortly, they're going to say something. So it's an interesting one when it comes to that. Like, it obviously got people very frustrated because it's like, wait, why exclusively only show it to like a handful of people, but still allow those people to sort of describe it, I guess. It's a bit weird, it's frustrating, but it's fine. He did later come back and do a kind of a reply to that tweet saying that I'm almost sure now that what we saw was General Fong's fortress from obviously 201, and it is clearly it's a ring-walled fortress / city that does have a rather large tower right in the middle. So he obviously went looking through visuals from Avatar to find something that was similar and matched it up quite clearly here. So that was interesting in that this obviously got people talking then about like, based on all the rumors that we have, how does this line up? What's the significance of like the location of this base, and how would this fit with regards to say a Zuko movie? How would this fit for a Kyoshi movie, or how would it fit for Korra or Avatar after Korra? And that was where the speculation went. People were all over this stuff. Did you have any thoughts on it sort of being more, I suppose, directly identified as maybe being the fortress from 201?
No, I mean, it's nice that, you can actually post, or you can actually like put a point where it actually is based off of that information. So that's generally, really sort of like helpful. So I like, that someone actually went through and actually did that part.
Mm-hmm. So from there, we were actually kind of waiting a little bit. I think what Avatar News did, I think, was that he came out and basically said, basically teasing something that he had some sort of news to reveal. And people roughly got him to say that like it's news about, I think, both Avatar Studios and also the Netflix show as well, because people were unsure about which it would be about. So I think in the middle of last night, he put up the post about Avatar Studios, and it was actually really, really big. So it seems like he was able to compile a lot of information from the sources he had with other people who have their own sources, and felt confident enough to put this post out more or less as close to as possible, confirming what the 3 movies are and an estimate on their release dates. So, according to Avatar News, he is saying that the first movie, the Laura Montgomery directed movie, will be the Kyoshi movie, and this will be coming out in 2024. He also went on to say that the second movie will be the Zuko-focused movie that he teased the previous month, and that will be a 2025 release. And that the kind of completely out of nowhere, brand new news, the third movie we didn't know about before will be a Korra movie scheduled for 2026. So there's not too much like details to this, but it's nice to basically know what the idea is for Avatar Studios. That here's 3 of the first projects, and they are hitting all of the key pillars of the fandom right now. They're doing effectively an Avatar movie, Korra movie, and Kyoshi has become like probably the third most popular thing after that. And they're doing all of them at the same time. Now he goes into a slight little bit more detail, just covering the idea of, he has cross-checked it with sources, including the stuff about the dates. He also has, like, he's saying that's not just a vague estimate as a fan, but that people are saying that that is the plan. They obviously could change, and making it clear that, like, it's not confirmed just yet, things could change, but that right now this is what he's working with. So everyone has kind of gone with this, and believe it's true. It just seems to fit too perfectly. It is sort of the ideal lineup, and we're hoping that this will be just directly confirmed at some stage. But this got people excited, way more excited than the actual official news that came out. So it's very interesting that we're in full on like leak season with Avatar Studios. So what were your thoughts on seeing the Avatar News article confirming a lot of details here?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, if this is the real sort of timeline that they're going for, and, like you said, it ideally it makes sense with what we've learned before, and, what has progressed so far. And it seems like there is some stuff that they already have, even if it's just a sort of like early concept, that this, this makes sense in terms of what they're, hoping to be able to produce over the next, 3, 4, whatever amount of years at this point. So I don't know. I like that we're, like you said, like everyone has definitely run with this. It seems like it's like as official as we're going to get for a period of time, even if it isn't from, one of the officially released, websites that they normally use to actually mention things. And some of the other stuff, if the earlier announcements have been actually mentioned on some of the actual, like, official social media channels from Nick and Paramount and stuff like that, but nothing along the lines as this article has in details. Even if they do mention that some of the stuff here isn't like 100% set in stone. So like I wouldn't be surprised if some of this changes or anything like that. But it's a nice setup for what we think is going to happen and what as far as they've mentioned on from official sources is to be expected. So here's hoping.
Yeah, and just to put it into perspective, just like how widespread this has been, this news, the Avatar News article has become. When he posted last month, some of what he was referencing here about the whole Zuko movie, prequel movie, which was previously the biggest Avatar studio news, his Twitter post about it had just under 10,000 likes and just under 2,000 retweets. This post, the big Kyoshi Zuko Korra post, has 146,000 likes, 2,000 comments, 52,000 retweets. So this is like everywhere is picking this up. Like people I follow who don't even, for non like Avatar reasons, even happen to come across this one. So this is super, super widespread. This is not just something where you can say that it's just a hardcore fandom have seen this news. At this stage, I think everyone who has any interest in Avatar has seen this news, and this is what people are going with right now. It feels like it's big enough to where it probably may actually force their hand to maybe have to confirm this at some point or come out with the actual information. That's how big the unofficial post actually is. So it is huge how much this is. So it was kind of crazy to wake up this morning to this and just everyone saying like, hey, it's been a few hours, why haven't you covered this yet? But yeah, when did you come across this post?
Yeah, no, it's funny. I think my friend sent it to me like late last night or something like that. And then I saw it when I got up this morning. I was like, oh, interesting. So I guess this is what we're going for right now. This is what everyone is going to be talking about for a while now. So no, it's definitely, it definitely has made the rounds. And I do wonder if this would be the sort of thing that would force their hands, or if they're just going to, just not really need to say anything about it, which I don't know. I think that might even be the better way to go about it until they're really ready to, say something. But it definitely has made the news. I'm sure, anyone who's paying attention to this is aware that this has been said, whether it's true or not at this point. So it does make me wonder if maybe if any of the events coming up, they might, say something at one of those because of this. Because, maybe that'll give them a bit of time to prepare if it's like one's coming up or in a couple of months. But yeah, definitely has made waves for sure.
Yep, everyone's already joining the Comic-Con hype train. People are already aboard, waiting for this. Because I was leaning in that direction of like, okay, I guess this has to be ahead of a more public announcement, and we're like a month away from Comic-Con. It kind of feels like this is the time to make the announcement, and because Avatar Studios was announced as this big like kind of multimedia thing, it kind of feels like it has to not just be about the Kyoshi movie, but they have to be like, this is the plan for the first three, and actually basically come out and say what this post says, but probably with a little bit more detail and visuals associated with it. I don't think we're asking for the world here, but just to see what they've been doing for the last like year and a half, 2 years. We need to, I suppose, be able to 100% for sure say this is what's going on. So everyone's already being like, okay, SDCC is where it's going to be. There's obviously the opportunity that they maybe wait for NYCC as well, but I think there's maybe a bigger history with San Diego Comic-Con, as like it's more, I suppose, typically known as like the absolute big one. But we'll wait and see what happens. But where are you at? Do you think this is all leading up to like they are just about ready to make the first proper big announcement?
I don't know. I mean, it feels like, you would, with what they've been talking about and what they've seemed to be showing, that there might be a lead up to sort of a bigger announcement. I mean, there's always wondering, do they actually have enough to sort of warrant, a huge announcement like that, or like I don't know, like I don't know if I see there being like enough for like their own panel, or like, their own room, like, like what they've done in the past where they've had the whole thing and people, wait forever, myself included, to get into it and stuff like that. Like, I don't know, if they're still developing stuff and it's going to be, a couple years or so like that, like, would it really be worth it for them to have like a huge thing like that? Like, I could see, if we see them mentioned in like some other Paramount panel or some other, Viacom Nick type of thing, then maybe it might be something that might be announced along the lines of that with a whole bunch of other stuff. I just don't know if I see it being sort of like a solo endeavor or something like that. But I mean, I guess when we see like, the panels, who's going to be there and what's going to be set up, then that'll probably like give it away more or less at that point. But yeah, I mean, the idea of it being at SDCC, since that is the one that tends to have more of the like TV, movie type of stuff. So in theory, it makes sense, right? Like what you were saying, that would be the one that they would announce at it. I just wonder if that's maybe too soon and they might want to keep it more low key and then go to New York Comic Con for that sort of reason, even though I think in terms of like numbers and attendance, at least up until recently, at least, New York Comic Con has had more people than San Diego Comic Con. And I know they've redone that center as well. I don't know if that's going to still hold true with everything that's changed in the world recently. But so I don't know. We'll have to see on that one. But I wouldn't be surprised, I guess, more so now than we were before, that something does get announced at one of the conventions coming up.
Mm-hmm. The only thing now is that I think they realize that the sort of like expectation for news and official reveal is now much bigger now, just because this post is out there with the news all but confirmed. If that we go through the reveal for the Comic-Con schedule and it's not there, they'll get a little bit of backlash. It's going to happen at this point because we're sort of properly into the sort of build-up news cycle now, so it's not just baseless speculation anymore. It's kind of like, well, we're waiting for this stuff to actually get confirmed, and it will, especially when like we know you've exclusively shown something to press, you have at least something you can show. So there's that, and I'm assuming that they maybe probably could have shown more, because now that we basically know that the first movie is a Kyoshi movie, it makes the description of like what the teaser actually is really weird. And that, like, what? General Thong's fortress, or a fortress like that. The Avatar returns Earth symbol to tease a Kyoshi movie? Like, what? That's a weird one. To do it that way. Because to me, if you're doing a Kyoshi movie, you tease Kyoshi movie with Kyoshi, just literally a screenshot of Kyoshi in maybe looking slightly different or something like that in the in some sort of a new style. There's your teaser for that movie. You don't need to show any plot or anything like that. That's all you need. But instead, they've shown an Earth Kingdom fortress, and we're meant to sort of connect the dots there. Like, it makes me wonder what the plot is going to be. And this is what everyone's gotten into speculating about is, okay, if these are the characters we're focusing on for each of these movies, what are they actually going to be about? And so straight away, people have gone for the whole, like, okay, is there going to be any adaptations in any of these? Because there's Avatar content, there's Korra content, there's Kyoshi content now. What are they going to do here? I've said it before, I'll say it again. I think they're going to stay heavily away from adapting, like, novels or comics. The only one I can maybe see them doing is The Search, just because if you cover Zuko anything in the gap, you have to explain to people who haven't read the comic why Ursa's there, who Ki is, who Noran is, and explain like how Azula is now in this weird position where she's leading this group of cloaked figures that sort of thing, where like it's an important story, what happens to Zuko's mom. You either have to incorporate that into whatever movie you're actually telling in flashbacks, or you actually tell it in full. Kyoshi, I think she lives long enough to where you don't have to tell the Rise of Kyoshi story as the actual story here. And I don't think any of that really connects with the visual of that fortress, so I think it probably will be something different. And then Korra, they just have pretty much anything, because it's completely open in the future of Korra where they go. There's a few themes and stuff like that to explore. Everyone wants the Fire Nation story for the comic, but we're probably not getting comics for a while now, so, you know, a trip to the Fire Nation movie, that seems ideal. And I think that's the kind of obvious thing here. It's like Korra continuation, Avatar continuation, but Zuko's more in the spotlight. And then follow up to Shadow of Kyoshi as the Kyoshi movie. See what they do. But what's your initial speculation? Where are you thinking they're going to go with these movies and that? Are you thinking an adaptation is maybe possible for any of these?
I mean, from what they've said before in terms of like their, creative sensibilities, it doesn't seem like they're particularly keen on retelling things that have been told before. Like they seem to want to push things forward. So that would lead me to think that a straight up adaptation would be very less likely to happen compared to anything else. And, sort of like you've mentioned, the idea that, Kyoshi's been around, at least in terms of her longevity in her life, that there's a lot that you could go with. Like you could make up, a story pretty much at any point in her life, and you could probably get something new and interesting and fun and, explore her character in ways that we haven't already gotten. I mean, we got her sort of like intro to her, becoming an avatar and all of that. So that's pretty well established, even if, I'm going to assume this is probably true. A majority of people that do see the movie won't really have any idea what actually happens in the book, just because that's just sort of how it goes. I'm sure if the movie does well, then people will go back and try to read the books, and there'll be that whole maybe resurgence in terms of that. But I wouldn't be surprised if that's not high on many people's priority as it has been for us personally as fans of the show and stuff like that. But I wouldn't be surprised if there are some callbacks to something that happens in the book, like some key moments of the character, if it pertains to the story. As far as the Zuko one, yeah, I mean that's. I can't see, they always had the idea that, the search and stuff would be a movie, but I don't think, there's really a warrant for that to be in, high level detail or anything like that. It'll definitely be referenced because, there's just, like you said, there's too much information there that still to this day not everyone knows. So, it's going to be discussed in some way. Maybe it'll be some cool flashbacks. Maybe it'll be a little bit more in depth, or maybe it'll be a dialogue dump. I doubt it'll be something like that. But, in terms of the overall length, there's plenty of stuff there. Everyone wants them to be sort of talked about when they're a bit sort of like older than where they are in the comics right now. So being a focus wouldn't be surprised at all. So, a few callbacks along those lines definitely seems to work. And then, yeah, like for Korra, like there really is, so much they can do with that. And, if that ever, leads into something else, maybe it will, maybe it won't. But that definitely is wide open. I mean, there's 2 comics or so, dealing with that period of time. So clearly if they've, left that open for more exploration on their end, which I think is cool. And we'll just have to see where that goes. But yeah, no, I think there's definitely a lot that they can go with in terms of the stories and how they want to portray the characters, in their older-ish years, depending on how far they want to go with it.
Yeah, and that's one of those things where like I almost wish that like if they do get to confirming this stuff, I hope that they say something that like makes it clear that they either are or aren't adaptations, and they're not super secretive about just the general gist of what they're going to be about. because I think you need to get through a lot of the people who are maybe asking for an adaptation and just make it clear that, yeah, we're not going to be doing that. There might be some references on key parts, but the content's out there in a different medium for a reason. Read it if you want to experience it. That's, I think, probably the best approach that they should have. Kyoshi's a very interesting one, though, because you can kind of have her have like a whole separate life, because like Rangi's not going to live forever, but it feels like you're probably going to want to, bring people in on the basis of like, who Rangi is, like here she is in animation, and then just give something to the fans of the novels, but not have it be like super, super connected. Like I know a lot of people want to see like Yoon in animation, but maybe a little flashback kind of mention of that could be interesting, because I suppose we're expecting them to do things like they'll start each of these movies with a little bit of a narration to kind of catch you up or whatever, and they can tell stuff like that in that, like cover the idea of the false avatar, what's happening in the Fire Nation pretty quickly in a 1-2 minute intro at the start of the Kyoshi movie. You can quickly recap the events of the Search and Smoke and Shadow in the Zuko movie. And with Korra, I guess the Kuvira stuff, Tokuga, do you need to cover that? Just because there hasn't been too much significant stuff, but just the groundwork of what has happened in the comics for Korra. There's room to do stuff with. I think the other thing I want to talk about is actually just what the planned release schedule is. And like I said before, he made the point in the article to really double down on the idea that this is what sources are saying. It's not just like speculation that there'll be one movie a year, and that's what it is. It's like, no, this is the plan, or at least was the plan at some point. One movie each year, 2024, 2025, 2026, seems kind of a little bit crazy if you just follow any sort of like animated movie thing that this can actually happen. But they're obviously developing their own unique animation style that will incorporate, I suppose, the time benefits of 3D CG while still having the 2D look. And I'm assuming they're hoping that they can get that down enough to hit this schedule where it is 1 year between movies. It maybe means that, don't expect these to have like unspeakably high quality best animation ever, but that they're going to do something that makes it like efficient and as best as possible. But what are your thoughts on that schedule, the way it looks?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. The idea that none of them are like next year makes me think that no, this is more going to be like a overlapping production, multiple teams type of situation, rather than sort of like, one then one then one. At least in terms of like maybe say like pre-production and sort of setup and sort of, the concepting and along those sort of lines. So if they have more of that stuff, finished, then when they actually get into production, that they can just sort of, assuming that everything works out and that they're able to meet their deadlines and everything like that, that this doesn't seem quite as, unrealistic as it might seem if this was sort of like a back-to-back-to-back type project. Now, we don't really know sort of like the details in terms of like how long these movies are. Are they going to be like, your standard 90 or, will they be up to 120 or anything along those lines? So, it could just be because of, the length and the stories that they're choosing to tell that maybe it facilitates, this sort of release schedule more favorably than, if it was some other type of production. Hopefully, like you said, the sort of style that they're going for and sort of the benefits of their developing their, techniques for this, works towards their sort of benefit in this regard. I guess we'll have to, let time tell to see how well that actually works out in the end. But, it seems to be something that if you're able to develop in, sort of a competent fashion, that people will, seek it out and will have no issue with it as long as it, tells the good story that they're looking for. So hopefully that actually works out. So it doesn't seem too crazy to me if they have the sort of, production planning and everything upright and, nothing else gets in the way, which, only time will be able to tell about that.
Hmm. Yeah, because that's definitely something I'd like to see when I get to talking about it, them mention. Because anytime I bring up the whole, like, well, this is what they've said about the plan for the movies, is that, like, the high ups, was it Brian Robbins or whatever his name is, he originally said it was like CG, and that got people kind of angry. The job listings then seemingly confirmed it to more be like, okay, uh, it's a 2D, 3D hybrid, and somewhere in the description in there, it was getting across the idea that it's making sure the style looks like it's 2D over the top of 3D. Um, and just clarifying that to people who are going to freak out because it's not 2D full animation and so on. Because like that's something we haven't heard about. It's like, what animation studio are they working with here? Like, is it going to be Studio Mir? They seem busy doing a lot of other stuff, but have they opened up to a spot for Avatar? Who knows? But that's everything we have so far. So we've learned quite a lot here. If this is indeed like official and confirmed, and it just makes people very excited going into some of these events, and hopefully they deliver and come out and confirm some of this stuff. But let's not also forget that Dawn of Yang Chen is next month. So even if we maybe have this disappointment of like nothing for Comic Con, we at least know over the Comic Con time period we're going to have that book to kind of get into, and maybe that will be the fourth movie for 2027, Yang Chen, after her success in the novels. So that seems to be the way things are going. I suppose one final point is just that all this news is very movie focused, but they announced the studio as being about movies, series, spin-offs, and short form content. Where do you think this lineup of three movies and then focusing on that puts like a new series and the other type of projects that they're saying they will do?
Yeah, no, that's a good point there because it's, they've announced so much stuff that they're planning to do that it's sort of a wonder how everything's actually going to sort of line up with each other. So I don't know. For me, the fact that they seem to be focusing on these, I wouldn't be particularly surprised that those ones get pushed more towards, the side, at least for, the next couple years. Although depending on, and we don't know sort of like, the details of what those series are or how long they are or how they're choosing to make them. Because, depending on how they choose to actually produce them, they could, very well be done at the same time. They could even be, if they're not looking towards, another external studio, maybe something that they can do in-house if they have, the team in place for that. So there's a lot of different ways they can go about doing that sort of style. Maybe that's something that, they will give to Studio Mir because it's, something that could be, facilitated better with the sort of, traditional digital animation style compared to, what they want to do in terms for the movies. So maybe that's something that we could look forward to. Or, maybe they'll use one of the other studios that they've used, more on the state side of things that they've done for other projects, like when they've done other, smaller animations or when they've done stuff for like the previous video games along those lines. So it's not like it's, they're only locked into doing, one studio or one internal. There are, plenty of studios out there, some that they've worked with, which from what we've seen before, it seems like, they like keeping things with people that they know they can work with and stuff like that. But I'm sure, depending on the amount of projects, they wouldn't be, opposed to working with some other places as well, if it fits within the styles and everything.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, like I ultimately agree with that. I think until they come out and say what the organizing schedule for the whole thing is, it feels like it's possible, if Avatar Studios is as big as they're saying, that they could have like, here's the main team doing these movies, but we're also working on a series throughout these years as well. And I wouldn't be surprised if we move on a few years and it's suddenly like, oh yeah, 2025, the Zuko movie's coming out, and season 1 of the new series, and stuff like that, and that's what we eventually get to, um, because I'm assuming there'll be more movies to follow this. They're saying there'll be series, spin-offs and short form content, so they're saying that these movies will have theatrical releases, so it's kind of almost like secondary that they will then go on Paramount Plus. They need and will want to do series that are, you'll only see it on Paramount Plus. So I don't think they're gonna be like, you have to wait until what, 2027 maybe for a series. I can't see that maybe being the case, but somewhere along the way I think that's going to happen, because it is interesting that like the news has been all about films, and it was sort of prompted by this Annecy Film Festival happening. So interesting. But yeah, that's the news for now, and we will move into the reviews for this episode. So we're going to start with Avatar. We'll do Avatar, Korra, Avatar with our 3 episodes here. So that means we're going to start off here with 109, the Waterbending Scroll. This one's an interesting one, because it's definitely for me one of the weaker episodes from book 1, just because there's not as much going on. We get to a decent fight at the end, but it's more of a kind of comedy fight with the smoke screen, and the pirates are also involved. Similarly, the main sort of character conflict is that sort of one that's a little bit sort of awkward at times, of just, I'm slightly annoyed at you and jealous. And it's kind of the thing for both of the Avatar episodes that we're discussing this week, is just that, the strength of some of these kind of character dynamics that create the issues in the episodes isn't maybe quite there. But it's still a very fun episode. Iroh is very funny throughout this whole episode, because he's so not invested in, like Zuko is, in what's actually happening. And there's just some fun stuff that you don't see in a lot of other episodes, because the whole pirate dynamic is in here. But I don't think there'll be like a massive amount to discuss as we go through this one. But what are your general thoughts on the Waterbending Scroll?
I do agree that it is a fun episode. I think it's sort of, I don't know, it feels like it has more meat to it than it really does, because it has like Aang initially really reacting to like learning, more so what he has to do. But then it's sort of like off-puts you with more of the sort of like fun comedy side of things of the episodes, which is, what Avatar is known for. But I think, in terms of like the overall plot, that maybe like dilutes it a little bit. But it does have, like you said, it has fun character moments, as well as the other episode that follows this. So it definitely, it's a fun episode to watch, even if, parts of it definitely could be sort of like trimmed down or even skipped, depending on how you view the overall storyline.
Yeah, like this is an episode where like where we're thinking about the Netflix show, which is just finished filming. How much of this episode are they going to adapt? Like, I can see them maybe doing that initial thing of like an inexperienced Katara tries to teach Aang the little that she knows, and that's it, just to logically have a thing where like, I know something you don't know, it makes sense to do this. But the whole stuff with the pirates is very side plotty. I get they come back a little later on, but that is not super important for Zuko going into like the finale. Basically, it's just like an extra layer. But we'll get into this. So, obviously this stems off our sort of basically mid-season finale, even though we're not quite mid-season yet. Aang learns from Roku he needs to master all the elements, and he does not have much time. So Katara offers to teach Aang what she knows, even though she herself also wants to train in the north. So they land, and they straight away do it. She teaches him the like 2-3 moves that she knows, and Aang gets them immediately. And in fact, he is better at those moves than she is. And I like this, but it feels like I gain more out of this because like I add in the kind of extra stuff I know about sort of like how bending works into it, rather than the fact that the episode
Mm.
has like explored it itself. Because I'm kind of thinking along the lines of like, oh well, Aang's a master airbender, so of course he's going to adapt to a different element quicker than Katara, who has had no formal training. And it almost makes it weird that Aang hasn't helped Katara to learn bending more. I get it, they're two different elements, but the fact that Aang adapts so quickly to what Katara tries to teach him, I think speaks to the idea of, oh, I know how a bending form works. I know how to go through the stances for airbending, so it's just slightly different for water. Now, admittedly, water, air, they're relatively adaptable. They're not like opposites or anything like that. So there's that. But I wish they'd just gone a little bit more in on this and just created more of a dynamic rather than what they get to, which is just Katara gets more and more annoyed, eventually blows up at Aang, and the focus is more on Katara being sort of like competitive, and she's annoyed that she isn't the best waterbender in the group and that she shouldn't read the scroll. That's like the takeaway from this. But she goes back to it. And I never feel like they really come back around to this dynamic, really, because they reverse it when we get to the end and the finale, and that like Katara's more dedicated to her training, Aang's more naturally talented, so Katara surpasses him. It feels like the whole time through that the whole how they approach Aang in any way learning waterbending could have been done a little bit differently. But we'll get to that in a second. What were your thoughts on how they did this dynamic? Like a pretty significant thing, Aang finally trying to learn another element.
Yeah, no, I definitely get the point of, he understands bending at a level that, Qatar hasn't had any experience with, right? So like the idea that, and I think even Sokka mentions it in, the episode that like, you've already mastered, air bending, even though he makes it sort of like a joke saying that it took like 100 years or whatever. But, realistically, it didn't take anywhere near that amount of time. So clearly, if it's the fact that he's the avatar or just his own natural inclination for bending, he has a leg up in that regard. And yeah, they do eventually sort of try to like balance that out later on, although I don't know if that balancing out really works quite as well as they sort of hopes it does. But yeah, just the idea that she seems to be struggling initially with these couple moves, and even the one that she doesn't know, he's able to pretty much like perfect it in like 2 seconds. It feels a bit sort of weird the way that they're sort of going about it here. It would have been nice if, he does get more in depth, which he does explain sort of the idea of like flowing through the motions, and she does, sort of grudgingly try to sort of like incorporate that into her own sort of like move sets. But, I don't know, maybe if it would have been cool if before they get to the north that, there would have been a scene where he does sort of like go more in depth with that and explain it. So, there's a reason for this to maybe have more importance up until they actually get to the north. But that's just sort of, I guess, how they choose to do it in this instance.
Yeah, I think part of this is that like I would never overly like associate the kind of competitiveness, because I think Katara says that like, I'm sorry that I got so competitive about this. That's like her view on the situation. That is like an aspect with Katara, is that she gets too competitive. The argumentative side is more like her dynamic with Toph when she comes in, and that is maybe where that competitiveness comes out of. Whereas Katara and Aang's relationship is more that they actually do get on and do help each other through this. So I think the episode would have been a little bit better if they did just explore that idea of Aang as a master bender having to be the sort of lead as they kind of go through this kind of basic in a different element process for like, okay, Katara maybe understands the philosophy a little bit more, but doesn't know any of the technical aspects of bending. So when they get the scroll, Aang might be used to learning from scrolls, where it's Katara's first time ever seeing a move described in a scroll format, and how much about the actual sort of control of chi has Katara ever learned, whereas Aang would know that completely. Um, that could have been, I think, a little bit better than the sort of like small scale drama that they tried to kind of really turn it into, where like Sokka's pointing out that like, oh look, she's taking it away. You're never going to see that thing again because she's so obsessed with learning the move. And especially when they later do portray it as actually like Katara's like super talented. It's just like I guess as the Avatar just adapted very, very well. The other point is, I think the last Airbender movie showed that you can make a plot point out of Aang learning waterbending, because it is about flow of emotions, because this is how Katara found Aang in the first place, is that when she let the waterbending flow through the anger and annoyance at Sokka, she waterbent very powerfully, and that's what got Aang out of the whole ice system that he was in. With Aang, he's dealing with obviously like the loss of his people, a lot of pressure just being placed on him from the last episode. I think you could have very easily done a little bit of what the last Airbender movie does, and have him be like doing the techniques perfectly, but the bending is weaker, like he's holding back in some way, that it's not flowing for him, that he's doing it, but something's preventing it. And go a little bit into just the whole, let the emotions about the loss of his people flow, and just address the fact that, the group hasn't maybe discussed that all that much, because they haven't. That we kind of went past it in 103 and haven't really come back to it since. I think it's relatively fine as is. I'm okay. It feels sort of realistic that Aang adapts very easily to one of the other elements and struggles with the other two. I think that's fine. But in a book where you're maybe struggling for the bigger plot points episode to episode, I think this is something you could have done a bit more with. But what are your thoughts on how they could have, I suppose, made something more out of Aang's waterbending?
Yeah, I think if they did make something more out of the waterbending, especially if they did it earlier, it definitely would have helped sort of like ground him a little bit more, which, maybe that adds to his maturity or the group's overall maturity, just, sort of talking about the actual events that Aang has actually gone through up until, this point here. So I think in that sort of sense, it might have, benefited him as a character just to see him, initially struggle on things. That's something that, we do see him have those issues, as the series goes on. But a lot of those are later, and they are more towards the elements that he has a harder time with. So I don't know. I think there might have been a chance to do some sort of middle ground with that, because I think, as far as like, he doesn't need to struggle with all of them. And, it wouldn't be too surprising. Like it shows here that he would be really good at one. But, maybe there's some sort of like upper edge to an earlier move that, he would have, been taught or, learned on his own that might have, struggled a little bit. And that might have been a chance for him to explore that side of his character at least a little bit earlier on, until you do get to, the Northern Water Tribe, and you have to deal, you can have like an actual like master more mention, like in the movies, like sort of what's actually going on with his, internal struggles. But I think, like you said, it doesn't like seem the oddest thing here, even if it isn't really like a huge plot point towards the overall story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the rest of this kind of waterbending plot is basically that the water scroll is revealed to be the single water whip, and that they got it from the pirates. The pirates had stolen it from the Northern Water Tribe somehow. We don't know the exact details of it. So Katara steals it from the pirates who stole it, and that's why they have it. That's why the pirates are after them. The waterbending stuff comes to an end basically with a few kind of team up moments from Aang and Katara with waterbending. They use the sort of push and pull of the water to basically launch the pirate ship and kind of steal it. Basically, they keep themselves from going over the waterfall, again, using their teamwork quite well together, but it still goes over. In the middle of the action, Katara actually uses the water whip correctly in action, which I suppose relates to the whole freezing move she did in like the first two-parter. She missed it the first time, got it right afterwards, showing that she is a quick learner herself. And the net result of this is just that like stealing is wrong, except when it's from pirates, and that's it. Like I said, there's no real learning from this. The lesson is not necessarily that Katara isn't competitive. There's no real final scene of her like overly like apologizing to Aang because it wasn't that big of an issue in the first place. So there's just a slight sense that like, okay, they're both good waterbenders is the main takeaway, and the dynamic was just very, very light overall. But what are your thoughts on how they wrapped up the kind of waterbending focus of the episode?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, as you go on, you get to see that Katara is pretty skilled in that, even if it does take her a couple, a little bit more to actually practice the move, that she does get the technique, and they work, her and Aang work together really well, as you can see in this episode and even the next one as well. So, there's not really, an issue between the two of them in terms of them, flowing with everything, and, eventually how it ends up in the end, we know that there's no issue there as well. So, I don't know, maybe they sort of focus a little bit more on sort of the wrong, sort of conflict between the two of them in terms of, them actually interacting with each other. I mean, it does cause for some, fun moments here, but I think, like you mentioned, the idea that there isn't sort of like a huge resolution point, and they even sort of make a joke about everything in the end, shows you that maybe the strength of, what they're going through here isn't as, relevant as it could be.
Mm-hmm. I suppose we'll go to the pirates next. I think I mentioned in the last podcast that like, oh, maybe there'll be some Dao Fei connections to have since we learned about that since, and it's kind of like, not really. I guess the legacy is still there in that like piracy. I guess they're sort of saying it's more than just being just standard bandit. That there's a little bit more to it, like pirate code, Dao Fei code style thing, but they don't overly characterize this particular crew as being anything like particularly crazy, outside of the fact that they clearly opened their boat up as like a shop at times. Other than that, it's like it's sort of notable that I don't think any of them are benders. They tend to be all sort of, I suppose, martial artists with different skills, different weapons. You see a couple of things you sort of never see anywhere else in the series. Like one guy has like a kind of double harpoon neck gun thing. The captain seems like a pretty skilled practitioner with the single sword. The the guy who brings everyone on board the ship kind of uses like smoke bombs and kind of throwing implements. It's like, okay, that's cool, that's decent, but they don't stand out like, say, as much as the freedom fighters do from the next episode. So they're interesting, but not super interesting in the sense of like, you're looking at all these new characters they're introducing, and there's been a lot of hits so far in the early episodes, not too many misses, and I'd say the pirates are maybe a little bit in the miss category, but they do come back, so that's sort of interesting. But I don't think they're still that great when they do come back. It's just a nice reference in the way they're brought back in. But what are your impression of the pirate crew that we meet here?
Yeah, no, that's funny that you mentioned that. I mean, when you see the episode and when you're watching it like throughout the series, like they seem like a cool group. Like they're interesting. They have a couple funny lines. They create some conflict for our characters. They seem to be, reasonably skilled in what they're able to do. But they do sort of come across as sort of like your run-of-the-mill, slightly above average, group of antagonists towards our main core characters here. So they serve their plot point in the episode, but in terms of like all of the great sort of like side characters that we're always talking about in Avatar, they don't particularly stand out, and maybe that's just because they're not more so like named compared to other ones, or more of them aren't named, but I don't know. I mean, they are able to get the one up on our characters, like even if that's sort of they're sort of like, I guess, their skills that they have from being able to get people who aren't aware that they're trying to be captured. So like they're reasonably skilled, like you mentioned, like they're all non-benders as far as we can tell, and that's sort of how they use their powers in this battle. The captain, is at least in close quarters able to go up against Zuko, who, at this current time, we consider him, a really good bender at this point. Granted, Iroh wasn't involved in any of this, who probably could have taken everything over by himself if he really wanted to. But he's just sort of like nonchalant in this episode, which, is kind of core to his character, so it's not too surprising there. But yeah, I mean, they seem like a fun group. Like you mentioned, they do come back later on and they serve their purpose there. But yeah, these are probably like out of like our characters that have like, more than one appearance that are reasonably skilled, they do sort of get forgotten. And I guess it probably doesn't help that they're so early on in the season as well that, they just sort of get left to the wayside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a few interesting points here. Yeah, the pirate captain versus Zuko is kind of an interesting one in that like it's Zuko involved in a fight against a sword fighter, when we're going to find out in a few episodes that Zuko himself is actually kind of a master of swords himself. So it's an interesting thing of like, it makes you kind of wonder for like these early episodes, why doesn't he like use swords as well? And it's in a way kind of like part of his character why he doesn't do that, and why especially like in most of the series it's like almost separate personas. The guy who uses just the firebending, which he's only just becoming good at, versus the other side of him who's like actually an expert sword fighter, like one of the best in the series, but he doesn't actually use it. It's very interesting the way they do that. It's not really at all a focus of this episode. It's just an interesting point to note that like Zuko probably would have like demolished the captain if he used swords, but instead he has sort of a protracted battle against him with his firebending. But you mentioned Iroh there, and it's interesting. He just effortlessly steps in and stops both of them. Like, he basically sort of beats both of them with like one quick move, stepping in between them, and then makes his joke about, your ships have set sail, it's a pun and stuff like that. So even Iroh gets another chance to subtly show how skilled he is, like he's done before. I do like the battle in the smokescreen, and just how chaotic it is, because you get the scene where like Sokka convinces the pirates that like, hey, Aang's more expensive than the scroll. Let's all have a fight here. And probably my favorite moment of the episode is definitely like Sokka and Aang calling out to each other. Aang disperses the smoke, realizes that like, oh no, I'm right in the middle, and then just brings the smoke back. That was a really fun little gag that he can do that with airbending. And yeah, it's just like a massive melee. Everyone gets a little bit of a chance to shine. We've sort of been tracking Sokka's progress, and he handles himself pretty solidly, I think, against the pirates. They 2-on-1 him, and they kind of throw him out onto the deck, and he kind of is out of action for a little bit, but then he comes back and kicks one of the guys overboard. So it's kind of like, yeah, Sokka's, definitely taking out a few people, still progressing, and that's nice to see. Other than that, there's not too much really to say. So there's that. Do you have any thoughts on sort of the action that we see in the episode?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fun. I think it's one of the, like you said earlier, it's one of the sort of fun fights that they have in Avatar, where there's stakes involved, but it's nothing too serious compared to what we see later on, at least. And like you said, everyone does get a little bit. The whole gag with Aang and the airbending and the smoke, I think, is cool. I think that adds, one, it makes it so that you don't have to see, or that they don't have to do as much in terms of like animating the fights, but it gives you a good idea of what's going on, and that's like sort of like your classic gag in terms of like fights and stuff like that. So with this the geared audience for this show, I think that idea of that works pretty well. Even though it might have been cooler to actually see the actual battles, but you do get to see some of them on the side here, and the characters, or the pirates, and the Fire Nation warriors here are sort of like your nondescript generic sort of fighters here. So there's no real highlight that needs to be focused on them. But yeah, that works. You get to see a little bit of action here, and you get to see a little bit more action on the actual water, and some more of their bending working together in terms of this, and then you get to see how they're actually able to escape with Appa and everything. So no, I think for the episode that we're saying doesn't have a huge like overall sort of like plot point, it's a decent fight to have in it.
Mm-hmm. And then just a few final things. It's just kind of like there's a few kind of object kind of plot points of like obviously the waterbending scroll itself. But the bison whistle that Aang buys at the start of the episode is actually sort of an important thing that gets used in later episodes. They focus a couple of times on that statue with the ruby eyes. Like I think Katara looks at it and is like entranced by it. Iroh buys it, and I think it appears in a later episode. He buys the Sungi horn, which is kind of important for like the soundtrack in this episode as well. And then of course, the whole Zuko plot point is informed and happens because Iroh has apparently lost his lotus tile, and it's the first time we're really hearing the significance of this, that it's part of this unusual strategy that he employs in the game. And right now it just comes across as if it's just Iroh completely ignoring the importance of Zuko to finding Aang, that this is more important than being his nonchalant self. But it's actually kind of like, oh no, he needs the Lotus Tile, because without it, if he comes across Lotus people, he can't do the thing where they play the game in the set way to kind of talk to each other. So we later learn that there's much more significance to it, not that it maybe massively comes across here. And then of course the joke, which I think is quite good, that it was in his sleeve the whole time, and then Zuko tosses it away, is a fun way to end the episode, because Zuko tries so hard throughout this episode and it just completely like backfires on him. So Iroh is very, very fun. But what were your thoughts on this as being the sort of the first time we're seeing the Lotus come into play?
Yeah, I mean, first seeing this, I'm sure I didn't have any sort of inclination to the importance that tile has, or that the game in general, Paisho has in the Avatar world. It just seems like it's another form of chess or checkers, or some other type of game like that someone might play. But you can see in the episode that all of what looks like more the sort of like older members of the crew are really sort of like invested in this game. So there's some like importance there, even though you don't quite get it. But yeah, it is kind of funny when you do learn that it does have like a particular reason for Iroh to really be like invested in this, even if throughout the whole episode he's pretty like nonchalant about it, which I guess is just sort of his character and how he's at least initially here being portrayed. But I think that's definitely a cool thing, and yes, it's nice that there are some other little callbacks throughout the whole series that get mentioned in this episode. I think Avatar does a really good job of that.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose is there anything else from this episode that you want to bring up?
I don't think there's anything that I have. So yeah, no.
Yeah,
that's it for me.
Yeah, I think that's mostly it. We do see the cabbage merchant again, so that should be noted in terms of like, okay, there's the other appearance. He actually mentions Omashu in this one, which is kind of interesting. So they don't do that as much as we go on. But yeah, from there we'll actually jump over to our Korra episode for this episode, and that is K107, The Aftermath. So, like we've been talking about, most of the Book 1 episodes of Korra are very, very good, and especially once you get through the one episode that most people have an issue with, 105, we're on an amazing run of episodes. We had the mid-season finale last time out, which was great. This is a great episode, and all the ones that follow this are also very, very good. I particularly like this episode because I think it's, at least for me, it's Asami's strongest episode, because we get the main Asami character moment within the series. Now, it's a little unfortunate that she has that moment 7 episodes into the series, and for the most part, maybe doesn't come close to having a moment as significant again. But it doesn't take too much away from just how strong this moment actually is. And then beyond that, I like so many of the scenes in this episode as they go through it. The investigation into first Cabbage Corp and then Future Industries, learning more about Hiroshi, the reveal coming out, the conflict between Cora and the rest of the group because she's working with the police here. It actually works. It's a little bit more of a, again, focus on the drama, but it works here. Unlike it's more manufactured in the previous one, it makes sense why there's a conflict in this one. And then, of course, we lead to the big moment in the underground facility. I really, really like this episode and don't really have any complaints with this. I think there are better episodes, but this is, for me, pretty high up there overall. But your thoughts on the aftermath?
Yeah, no, it's definitely a great episode. I think, like you said, the conflicts that arise in this one seem to hold a lot of weight, and they force our characters to make, some pretty serious decisions, and that definitely causes, a lot of them to sort of butt heads in this point, and it definitely does give us, a strong moment for Asami, and there's probably like maybe one or two, maybe just one other moment that I can think of off the top of the series that really, gets into her character and has her, reflecting on her choices. And this one definitely, sort of puts her at odds here, and is the one that people always sort of like mention in terms of like, what could have been, or what was the original idea for the character, and along those lines. So I think there's definitely a lot to this one. In terms of like the overall plot, and just pushing things forward with our sort of core group here, that this is probably the one that really gets the group of our four characters here really together at this point.
And I think that's where we should start, in that Asami has felt a little separate to everyone, because outside of the first episode with her, we haven't even focused much on the Mako-Asami relationship, because like we pointed out sort of oddly, in the shipping episode, Asami is not much of a focus at all. It's the other three, not her. So she comes back in here, and we start off straight away with this dynamic of, because the arena's been shut down, it's so badly damaged, Mako and Bolin have to move out. Cora offers them a place on our Temple Island, but Asami has already offered them a place in her mansion. So immediately it's a little bit of the kind of jealousy, kind of conflict between Cora and Asami, because as we've noted, they haven't properly interacted up to now. They were introduced to each other at the meeting, and they've sort of seen each other like before and after some of the pro bending matches, but you can tell Cora tries to leave the room as soon as possible whenever Asami and Mako are there together. So I like the sense of sort of tension there, because it is sort of natural given what the dynamics have sort of been up to now, that Cora views it as being sort of relatively awkward. Even though Asami's being nice, Cora doesn't overly want to interact with her right now. So what are your thoughts on this this opening scene here?
Yeah, I mean, that's really a good point there, that Cora, and it's really sort of like a one-way sort of conflict, because, Asami, up to this point, I think maybe she's done maybe like one odd look based off of what Cora said, which leads you more into the idea that Asami doesn't really see, the issue that Cora might have with her at this point, which I guess as far as we know, she wouldn't know that there's been any sort of like, shenanigans going on with her and the brother. So I guess maybe it makes sense that she sort of wouldn't be really in the loop, and I'm guessing we're going to assume that Mako hasn't really said anything to her, which, maybe doesn't speak as well of him as a character as everyone always wants to try to point out. But yeah, at this time here, it really, just Cora just doesn't quite know enough about Asami, which is the whole point of this episode, and I think that part actually works out pretty well.
Indeed. And from there, that leads to Asami does invite Cora to come to the mansion. She doesn't want to go initially, but Bolin sort of coinces her to go, and so she arrives at the mansion. The other three are hanging out at the pool, and Cora feels a little out of place. It does get brought up here, an interesting point, that Mako's like, you never asked your father if we could actually stay here, and she says the line that it's easier to ask forgiveness than permission, which is kind of an interesting one in terms of like whatever the dynamic is meant to be like between them, because as we go through the episode and kind of the series in a way, it seems like they actually have a pretty good relationship. We obviously find out he's keeping things from her, but it seems like she ultimately looks up to him. So the fact that there is a little bit of this dynamic where she's used to sort of just doing things without telling him and asking for forgiveness, rather than can I do this, is sort of an interesting one. But what are your thoughts on this one? Because it feels like a very kind of heavily written line that this was there for like a reason, her saying this.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if it goes along the lines of just her, being brought up in this sort of like high society, rich sort of environment that, she has this idea that she can get away with things more so because of that than any other reason, or if that's just sort of, how she views the world. I don't know. It is a good point because it doesn't seem, like you said, like it doesn't seem until later on in this episode that there has been any sort of like conflict. So I wonder if there's something in her history that we haven't learned about, maybe when her mother was still around or something like that, that would lead her, or maybe something after her mother was killed that would lead her to have this sort of mentality. I mean, I don't know, maybe it's trying to push our idea of the character along the edge that maybe she might not be sort of like as good as we think she might be, which of course we later find out that that's not true at all. But maybe that's sort of what they're trying to sort of like hint at you to throw her off, so that when she does finally make her choice, that you're more so impacted by that.
Because that line, I'd immediately like interpret that, not knowing what happens next, as maybe Hiroshi's maybe not around as much, and so they're a little bit disconnected from each other, but still get on okay. And so, because she's used to mainly doing stuff on her own, she never maybe has the chance to ask for permission, so she just goes ahead with it, knowing that, I suppose, he's maybe absent and would just be like, I'm sorry, I wasn't around. Okay, you can do this later. But that doesn't seem to be the case, outside of the fact that it's later revealed that Hiroshi kept the whole equalist thing from her. But the way that goes seems to be that, like, he purposefully did that. They still have a good relationship. He just kind of hid his hatred from her because he didn't want to. He says, like, I wanted to keep this like for as long as possible from you. So he knew it would come out eventually. So it's an interesting one, but it plays into their dynamic, and I'd like to know more about it ultimately. But this is where we get the sort of like Korra's view on Asami. Korra just expects that the day Asami has planned for them will be all about, basically doing girly things like makeups and stuff like that. Makeovers. Bolin actually wants to do that, but Korra doesn't really. But Asami actually surprises Korra by taking them to the Sadomobile sort of like test track, and she gets Korra in the back of one of the Sadomobiles, and they go, racing on the racetrack. And this is a kind of shock to Korra that Asami does this, basically kind of like fighting on the racetrack. That seems like it's a whole other side to her that she never knew about. And so we get this race sequence, and it ends with Korra actually apologizing to Asami for basically, assuming the way she would be when she's actually much more maybe like Korra herself. Asami mentions she also knows self-defense, so she can't take care of herself. And it's, this is properly, they now have gotten to know each other, they're friends. So the Team Avatar group is together, even though Team Avatar doesn't form until next episode. So pretty good stuff, and we'll get into the fact that this scene gets referenced again in later material in just a second. But what were your thoughts on, I suppose, the first moment of Korra and Asami bonding?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it would be like the perfect way for them to bond, and it's at this time is completely unexpected of Korra and what she thinks of Asami at this point. I mean, I like the sequence overall. It definitely has a lot of energy to it, and it's pretty fun to watch, and you can see them sort of go back and forth here, and it really is, like you said, it's just like a battle on the racetrack, which considering at the speeds they're presumably going at, could be really dangerous. But I guess that's part of the fun, and the whole idea is to show that Asami can really hold her own in different sort of situations, and the whole idea of the self-defense comes up later on, and we can see that that's even like more so than just sort of self-defense as well. So no, I think it's a really good scene to show their character growth together here. Just as sort of their beginning friendship, even if later on that kind of does all fall apart.
Mm-hmm. And like I said, they reference this again in Turf Wars as kind of they're developing the Korra and Asami relationship. There's just a scene, I'll just read it out here. Korra says to Asami, "Remember when we first met and you took me race car driving? I remember how terrified you were. Was not. Anyway, what I remember the most was how relieved I felt." Relieved? Yeah, my whole life I was told I was too wild, too emotional, too intense, but it turned out you could be just as intense as me. I've never had anyone in my life who got me the way you do. And then they go into talking about another scene. It's a little bit of a kind of stretch. I've always felt that this scene's a little bit of a stretch to add like even extra importance on top of this. When, like we're talking about here, this is literally the scene where the two go from kind of having no real relationship other than being like minorly acquainted to actually being friends for the first time. And then for Korra to say that like this scene led to her feeling that this is the first time anyone ever got her the way she did. Again, they're making a slightly different connection in the comic, but it feels like they're maybe placing a tad too much importance on this scene. I would have much preferred they just referenced like say a book 3 scene where they have a little bit more of their friendship kind of behind them at this point, and they're more heavily focusing on the closeness of the two as friends. Going back all the way to the scene where they properly first met is kind of a little bit surprising to me. But what are your thoughts on the Turf Wars scene, and having just watched the scene they reference?
Yeah, that's funny. I forgot about that. But I don't know. To me, that seems like a stretch. Like, at least in terms of like what's presented here. Like, I mean, yeah, we don't know what Korra's thinking. There's no like sort of like VO narration or anything like that. So I suppose in theory you could superimpose anything you sort of want on that. But I don't know, because the way that you're mentioning those lines, that seems a lot more sort of like intimate than what we're seeing here, which is a lot more sort of like surface level in terms of her just like not thinking that Asami is like super, super girly or anything like that. Like she's just, she can do both sides of it at this point. So I don't know. I definitely personally don't read that much into this scene early on here, especially since, Asami at this point in time isn't into Korra as far as we know. Like she's just into Mako at this point. So I don't know, maybe if they had shown, maybe if Asami was in the whole sort of like drama fiasco that they had in the previous episodes, in terms of like, everyone sort of trying to figure out who they like and stuff like that, then that sort of statement would have made more sense. But as far as I can see here, that doesn't really seem to be anything along those lines. So I don't know, maybe we're not reading enough into the scene, or maybe we're reading too more into what they said in the comic there. But I don't know. It seems kind of clear what they're trying to go for in the comic scene.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think like, because otherwise I think the comic does a good job at developing them. It's just like it's the start of their relationship. You don't need to retroactively go back and like connected to the time they first met, when it took them basically until season 3 to be sort of close friends, because they don't get that many scenes together in like this book or the next book. It will be interesting to kind of track that a little bit. But I think even the both creators, when they made their statements after Korra came to an end, both sort of said that like you can see in the last 2 seasons their relationship develop, not the first 2. But still, it's a nice scene for them. They maybe just place slightly extra importance on it than they maybe should, especially because, like you say, it immediately sort of like turns where like Korra leaves, and then she is viewed as being on the opposite side of the debate after this. So it's a little odd to over focus on it. Um, but anyway, from there, this is where we get into the whole, I suppose, the investigation that happens, and we see that Cabbage Corp gets raided. Later, it gets revealed that, of course, it was planted there by Hiroshi Future Industries. So Lao Gan goes to prison for no obvious reason, but this gets the suspicions kind of going, of course, because he's trying to hide his involvement in everything. And when Korra is in the bathroom and overhears Hiroshi basically saying stuff like how Cabbage Corp has bought us time, we're now ready to strike. She's right to be suspicious about that. So I like how this sort of comes about, that she's actually happy about how things have gone so far, getting on well with Asami, and then all of a sudden she just inadvertently finds out that she's suspicious of Asami's father. It's the drama is there, kind of ready to happen immediately. But what are your thoughts on this sort of the plot turning here from being like a character kind of piece to more, this is the plot coming into play?
Yeah, I think that works well. I mean, this is sort of like the side plot, to sort of start off the episode before we're really getting into the meat of things. And, it's really not that much. This is like what sort of like the first like 7 minutes of the episode or so. So, the fact that after this point, everything starts moving forward, and it's like, a slight reprieve, which is what Bolin says at the beginning of the episode after all the craziness has gone down. So I think it works in terms of getting things going. It is, kind of unfortunate that, any sort of, relationship that, Korra and Asami had is pretty much ruined after this point. So that, I don't know, that also makes me think that, placing a lot of emphasis on the racing car scene might not quite work as well, because this pretty much deteriorates everything and almost brings her to odds with the brothers as well.
She goes to Tenzin and Lin about what she hears, and this is where we get the more detailed version of what happens to Asami's mother, Yasuko. So they don't name her here, of course. It was like after the series where we got the name Yasuko, but still, we're told that the Agni Kai triad robbed the mansion, and in the process, a firebender killed Yasuko. And they obviously speculate that that must mean that he has harbored anti-Bender sentiment ever since, and the investigation begins. They do also set up the idea of Lin realizes she's going to have to play the sort of visuals of this sort of carefully, because she's already seen to have failed to protect the arena last time out, and so if she basically arrests the wrong person, and it's a high up businessman, she's probably going to lose her job if this doesn't go right. So they build up that tension as well, which I think is quite good. But yeah, that is the most we ever get on what actually happened with Yasuko's death. I like the emotion of the scene. I don't think it was maybe the right time to do a full-on flashback, because I think you needed probably Asami and or Hiroshi to be in the scene if you were to do that. I still like to know a lot more about it, in the same way I'd like to know a little bit more about what happened to like Mako and Bolin's parents, in terms of coming back to it maybe, but it hasn't happened yet. But it adds a lot, I think, to the episode. But what are your thoughts on this scene?
Yeah, learning the history of Asami, I think it definitely is important. It gives more context to why she's had self-defense, why she's able to handle herself in more sort of like aggressive situations. So I think it definitely works in terms of just pointing that out to the viewer and to Korra as well, that there's a other side to her character that you haven't really learned about. But yeah, no, I think it starts to add more intrigue into the episode. There's a lot more, noir or, nuance that comes with this sort of, going back and forth here, the whole idea of that there's more politics involved, which I know is not everyone's favorites, but I think, in this time it sort of adds towards what they're going for, and leads Lynn along her own path as a character and what she has to eventually do as well. Even though Tenzin's still here and still involved in the mix, so the fact that they're all sort of like working together, I think, is cool. It gets to show their sort of like relationship grow as well. So there's multiple different types of relationships or friendships that are growing throughout this episode, and some work out in the end, some don't quite work out.
Mm-hmm. And this scene is obviously an interesting one because this is where they figure out that like, oh, this must be where like Hiroshi's anti-Bender sentiment came from, if we're correct about this. And then you're kind of thinking that like, oh, I wonder, does Asami have that same anti-Bender sentiment? And like, if you're immediately wondering how much of Hiroshi and what he feels has rubbed off, if any, on Asami. The scene I'll reference, I think it's from episode 4, is probably one of the more notable like romance scenes between Mako and Asami. Is just that she does say with Mako that like, I feel so safe with you, which I think is the one thing that we've got that really highlights that she doesn't feel like any sense of like that she hates benders because of what happens, because she's perfectly fine being in a relationship with a firebender, a powerful firebender. She actually feels safe around him, which is obviously the very opposite of, I guess, how Hiroshi feels. So I think that was pretty well done in terms of one of the more memorable lines of dialogue from Asami. But this is obviously what turns Korra against, the rest of the group for the most part, mainly Mako and Asami, because she walks in with Lin, Tenzin, like the other officers, and they're like, what are you doing? Like, we were just getting on well, and you suddenly, are suspicious of my father. And there's no like direct confrontation. I think Asami, she like says it to Korra, but it's more that she's like annoyed with the situation, full stop, rather than Korra specifically. It's actually Mako who kind of is takes it more personally with Korra, because they have that sort of closeness that I guess they don't quite have with Asami yet. Hiroshi tries to explain it away as it just being sort of like business mark of taking on the market and stuff like that, but he's okay with letting them search. And it's interesting that like Asami comes in here and she's the one arguing with the police and saying like, I can't believe you're doing this, and you're taking advantage of this situation to persecute my father. And it makes you feel like, oh, is this her? It feels like she's 1 degree away from saying that like, you're benders using your power over non-benders and making the point the book has been trying to make, but they don't go that far just about. So what are your thoughts on this scene where things begin to sort of turn?
Yeah, no, I think it really does almost feel like they are sort of like almost sort of right there, sort of like abusing their power, which is sort of playing into the whole plot that Amon's trying to go for the whole the whole book, right? So this sort of, in her eyes at least, unavoided accusation of this whole situation, definitely doesn't look really good. And when you do see the scenes later on when they're actually, investigating his warehouse, like, it seems like they're almost sort of like destroying some of the equipment or, the containers and stuff to actually get in there. So you definitely get the sense there that maybe they are sort of abusing their power, maybe a little bit, and that, maybe Sami's in the right here. And, that does bring her to odds a little bit with Korra, and like you mentioned, even more so with Mako, just because they do have that history involved here. So definitely, it's just not really a good look overall, and especially since it doesn't really turn out to be anything, at least initially, that doesn't help Korra's case.
Mm-hmm. And that's the point that happens here. This is where they have like their kind of like secondary argument. Korra remains convinced that Hiroshi is up to no good, and she hasn't just sort of misinterpreted him talking in some way. Mako actually goes as far as to again bring up the whole idea of like, you're just jealous because of like the relationship with Asami, that you're focusing on Hiroshi because Asami's in the way of like those two being together. And actually gives her this ultimatum of like, if you don't stop with this, consider our friendship over. So he's full on like, I suppose, supporting Asami in this and thinks that Korra is wrong. but Korra stands her ground and is then later given a lead about where to actually go. So it gets quite serious here, but I I I I don't view this as being one of the like hyper dramatic scenes like some of the romance stuff can be in Korra, because this feels somewhat reasonable because, you know, Korra's effectively trying to get like Mako's girlfriend's father put in prison and like suspects him of being like a mastermind. So it's a quite serious accusation that like Korra is having happen here, and Korra is the reason this whole investigation is happening. So it's one of those things where it's like, you know, it's harsh from Mako, but it's like Korra is also like kind of going for it with this, you know, putting her neck out there with this one. So what are your thoughts on this argument?
I wonder about that. Like, could have Mako seen it from the other side and maybe gave and more sort of credibility or more thought to, you know, what Korra was saying here? I mean, Mako isn't like full on sort of like detective Mako at this point, so you know, he's a bit, you know, biased at this point, which is reasonable. Like that sort of, the Asami's father said basically, you know, supported them directly in order for him to be in the tournament, and you know, he's currently letting them stay at the mansion as well, even if it wasn't sort of like super okay to begin with here. So I don't know, I think you definitely can get the idea that this sort of argument that they're having here is pretty much, you know, it feels like it fits, like you're saying, like it does feel like this would be more of a realistic one. And, you know, there is a lot riding on this whole situation. And, you know, you get to hear sort of like the overhang of like the radio announcements talking about like more so for Lin directly, less so than Korra at this point. But, you know, just in terms of how things are being viewed at by the general public here. So, you know, there's a lot going on here for all the sort of interested parties with, you know, the resolution of this, you know, event or this accusation that, you know, Korra's putting at Asami and her father.
Mm-hmm. And then just with regards to Mako here, they do sort of give him like a reverse situation in book 2 where like he's convinced, you know, Varric is behind this. That's where his investigation leads him. And he ends up not being believed by anyone, but, you know, holds his ground and is eventually proven correct. So it's very much the reverse of this situation where Korra is correct in all of this. And they're both pretty kind of like, I suppose, humble with the way they kind of, you know, deal with being correct in this situation. In that case, it's not a direct like Mako versus Korra. It's more like Mako versus like Lin and Mako versus Bolin as well. But it is interesting that they do give Mako what it's like to be on the other side of this situation. So we later find out that the informant here was hired by Hiroshi. So like ultimately this is a trap they're being led into. But as interesting as part of this is that like to make it realistic, he has to basically give them the completely real information. So I guess he was just aware of like they were fully onto him and would have found it eventually, so he just has to come clean about it. And this is where we really double down on the idea of like if this goes wrong, Lin's job is gone because of Tarlock. And so we pretty quickly make our way to the mansion, but we're directed outside to Hiroshi's workshop, which is a separate kind of building, but on the same property. And it is revealed that Korra is correct because there's a giant secret passage into basically a facility kind of built into the mountain. And Asami is like stunned by this revelation that she holds out hope for her father the whole time and defends him, but is stunned silent when Lin rips open the panel and shows the transport down below. I love the way these scenes go. It's quick pace. They get across that like okay, Lin's job's at risk. There's constant like tension between a lot of the characters because of the accusations going on, but then the revelation comes out and it's like Asami is ultimately the main victim of all of this because she trusted her father and now she doesn't know what to believe and she's in this awful situation. So What are your thoughts on the build up here to like, oh yeah, Hiroshi is behind this?
Yeah, no, it really does have a lot of attention to it. Like all of our characters has something to lose from this conflict, right? So like, all the brothers here, they don't want to believe this because they've been supported so far. Asami is her father. Korra, she's trying to do what she thinks is right. This is like her finally getting to do like her avatar duties, right? Like she's actually being, proactive, trying to help the situation. Doesn't seem, at this point, like afraid of what Amon can do to her or everyone else in the city. Like maybe she's more inclined by, seeing Tano earlier on. So she has, a little bit more drive to what she's actually trying to do here. But yeah, no, this definitely, ramps up the tension for the whole episode because this is really just coming towards, sort of the final conflict here and actually learning, the secret of everything.
Mm-hmm. So pretty cool dynamic here. Asami, Bolin, and Mako are sort of held upstairs because they were sort of like, I suppose, allied to some degree with Hiroshi. They're not in trouble as such, but they're waiting to figure out what the situation is. Korra and everyone else, like Lin, Tenzin, a bunch of officers go down, and we get the reveal, like huge Equalist facility here. The tease of this new weapon is revealed to be the mecha tanks, which were actually foreshadowed in the first episode. And then a door seals them in, and it's revealed to be a platinum door. This was where we got the reveal that, like, the whole metal bending thing, the purity of the metal determines how bendable or not it is, and, like, pure platinum is unbendable, even by Toph, is what we get here. So, huge reveal, and of course, like, Hiroshi has to be presented as the full-on villain here, tricking everyone. It was all part of his plan. It's a big moment, and I like that this is getting across that, like, oh, here's the explanation for why the Equalists were able to do as much as they did, is that they have this guy supporting them, and he's also a really good engineer. So here's the reason they have all this crazy technology as well. So great reveal, and just the way they just set the tension of, like, they set up the way everything's going to happen, of like the other characters who are up top are slowly going to make their way down, and this is going to set up the stages of the conflict at the end. It's really well put together. But what are your thoughts on the scenes when they go down?
Yeah, I think it's really sort of like imposing when they're sort of going down the tunnel. Like, you see that some of them get left behind because, of their previous sort of allying. But, I don't even think that's, much of the issue here, really. It's just, really, curious what they're going into. Like they're pretty unaware. Like it almost seems like this might not have been like, well, of course we learn later on it's not the best choice, but it really seems like maybe more thought should have been put into this. Maybe this is just leading more into the whole sort of like overconfidence of what the metal bender officers, think they have in this sort of situation and their advantage. So I don't know, maybe this is something that they should have learned, when they weren't able to sort of protect the arena as well as they have. But no, this is just one of those, maybe it's just one of those sort of hard lessons here. But yeah, no, I think it, definitely ramps up the whole idea of seeing this huge facility, and eventually later on we learn how like sort of like interconnected things actually are. But just seeing sort of the initial appearance of these mecha tanks and sort of how we they might potentially work, but the whole idea of the platinum I think is pretty cool, and we get to see that of course used many more times later on. But I think in terms of like first seeing this, that's something that, we really hadn't thought about that. Like, how would you counter metal bending? Like, what would be the counter to that? Like, would you just have to be able to like overpower them? Because I think up until this point, except for the previous episode, it seems like the metal bending officers, unless you get to sneak on them, they're pretty much, the top of the game in terms of being able to combat most situations. So it's definitely something to learn that isn't the case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just that dynamic of like, yeah, the metal bending cops have their armor, which is basically meant to completely counter chi blocking, like, or any sort of like, I suppose, physical combat really. And I suppose it's good armor just against general bending also. and they realize that, oh, technology like electricity, that's the perfect way to counter metal bending officers. It's like their weakness is by using technology and giving technology to any non-bender who wants to fight back. And the mecha tanks are just the kind of perfect example of that, where like you still have to be somewhat skilled to even take out someone with a chi blocking like a shock glove. But anyone who can learn to drive the mecha tank can take down benders at will, because you're completely safe in there as well. And yeah, the fight that happens here is really, really intense. What I like about this, and what they did a lot in Korra, was that they do at times in certain fights just really show the characters getting just smashed around, and that's what happens here. Like the metal bender officers just get knocked unconscious by electricity. Lin obviously gets smashed against the wall a few times. The way Korra gets taken out seems kind of brutal as well, where like you get the impression that like, oh yeah, like Lin's injured for a while after this, so like she probably broke some ribs at the very least in all of this. Same for Korra, and it's that kind of Tenzin last stand moment. We of course get a better one in book 3, but here's a little bit of that, highlighting that he's the last bender left standing before he eventually gets taken out as well. And just that, once again, it's I suppose similar to the scene in episode 3 where Korra and Mako nearly get taken out by a few equalists. Here it is kind of again, but with the chief of police, the best airbender in the world, the Avatar, and like all the best officers. They just get completely taken out by this new technology. I think it's a really good scene with how many characters are involved, for sure. But what are your thoughts on this fight?
Yeah, no, there are quite a few characters in here, and I think, the metal bending officers, they do, at least initially use sort of their typical sort of techniques of restraining, other people, other benders, which, in some cases might have worked, but you can clearly see that the mecha tanks in this case are definitely like overpowered compared to, what they're able to do in conjunction with their bending, which, kind of makes sense. The whole idea is to like equal the level battlefield right here. So that dynamic that they're trying to show here, I think really comes across really well, just to show you how strong these are. And they're not like perfectly impervious. Like you can see the first one that Len attacks, which she does more of like your direct sort of blunt attacks, definitely gets taken out or damaged to a certain degree, but only she seems to be able to do that, and even then she still gets sort of countered eventually, because she has to focus everything on one at a time, and there are other ones around there. So no, it definitely is a really good battle scene here, just to show that they're not aware of what to do here. This is like when Korra was first learning how to do sort of like the pro bending type of, water bending, that, there's different techniques that you have to use in this. And, later on we see, that they pretty much figure out how to deal with the mecha tanks. Like this is like the first time seeing any sort of technology or any sort of like, technique. Like you don't know how to counter it at all. So you have to learn how to do it. And fortunately, they're able to learn how to counter it, because that would be unfortunate otherwise. But yeah, it's definitely something that they're just not prepared for at all, which is sort of, the whole idea is like the secret weapon that they don't know about. But no, the whole scene is really good. I definitely, seeing Tenzin stand out, as an airbender, it always seems that sort of works out that way, just because people don't really know how to deal with airbending, right? Because it hasn't really been around. So why would you have any sort of, perfect counter to him automatically designed? Although I'm sure, the fact that they have the whole ropes and everything means that they definitely were sort of at least thinking about it. But yeah, no, his techniques are always cool to see, and his special move that he does when he's able to run around really fast is always fun to see.
Yeah, the air cycle thing that he does is really, really cool. But yeah, it's cool because it shows you, I suppose, what they're doing. The benders more try to fight the technology head on, when they need to kind of think about it a little bit more. There's always like a weakness to technology and something like that, because it needs to be assembled. It needs to what's its power source, and they kind of begin to figure that out as time goes on, in that like Tenzin realizes that I should stop smashing air directly at it and more just like launch it into the sky like he does later on. I think Korra later just puts water into the sort of like vents and stuff like that. Mako shocks it because of course he's a lightning bender as well. But I assume like a continuous fire blast would also like overheat it eventually. And then Lin was probably like the one with the best tactics of kind of realizing that that maybe she knows enough about metal that she knows platinum is not like the hardest metal out there, and that like, oh, my things are made out of like, like really really hard steel, so I can kind of cut through it or something like that. That would have been a cool thing, but I suppose they didn't want to get super technical into like all these details on metal and so on, because we have that weird situation where like the meteorite sword is like, it's actually a relatively soft metal, but apparently it makes for like the sharpest sword, which I guess sort of makes sense. But there's all those little fun dynamics. So yeah, from there we see Mako and Bolin find their way down. Fun little trick. They do one of their sort of things that they used to do on the streets together. Mako with his sort of fire sneeze and so on. They get down there and they just try to kind of very sneakily grab like Tenzin, Korra, and Lin, but they are captured quite quickly. It was not a great plan, but there wasn't a lot else they could do either, because it was either they try and like fight everyone, which wasn't a good idea, or they just do the last ditch, try and sneak everyone out. So they did what they could, but of course this leads to the reveal of like, say, Hiroshi to Mako, of like, oh yeah, like this is the way I've been this whole time. It's been so difficult to act like the person you thought I was, and the most difficult part was seeing Asami in a relationship with a firebender like you. So that's a kind of really harsh words towards Mako there, and highlighting the kind of real hatred there of like, he doesn't care that like Asami likes the relationship with Mako. It's just he's not happy about the fact that he had to act like he was okay with it. So what are your thoughts on the brothers finally making their way downstairs?
Yeah, no, the whole idea that this was just like a huge cover, this Mako word, is just, something that he can't really, he doesn't really want to believe that. And, we get to hear him say that again, himself later on. It's a hard thing to actually see here. But yeah, I think they went about, trying to get away the best way they could. I mean, I guess they didn't quite be as sneaky as they could be if they sort of would have looked around a little bit more. But, I think, yeah, it makes sense that they would be the ones to sort of follow up on the situation, and Bolin using his earthbend to sort of come out from sort of the ground rather than maybe the real location, since I'm assuming their sort of main entrance was still blocked, so they had to figure out sort of a way around the whole situation, or around the main platinum door. So no, I think in terms of like this sort of conflict here, definitely it works. It's just another tension point in this episode that sort of just leads you to the eventual big issue.
So yeah, after this, Asami arrives downstairs, and we get the big moment. Like it's Asami seeing her father acting like a full-on villain. That everything that was said by like Lin and Korra about him was actually full-on true, and she tried to defend him but was proven wrong. And the person she thought she knew really well, her only family left, is actually this villain who is an equalist and has lied to her for all this time. He does say he tried to keep her out of this side of himself for as long as possible, and then he tries in this kind of last ditch attempt to have her play into the same like situation as him. Tries to make her hate benders, of like, benders killed your mother, they ruined the world, I think he even says at this point, and offers her the shock glove of like, take this, join me, and stop the benders. So it's an emotional kind of plea here to Asami, and she's in a very kind of delicate state. It's a great scene of how they pace it out. She takes the glove, you can see a concerned look on her face, But when she puts the glove on, they have this very like determined look on her face, like angry, but you could also view it as being potentially like, oh, villain, like is she siding with her father here? But no, she apologizes to her father, shocks him, uh, effortlessly takes out the lieutenant and shocks him, and the group very quickly manages to gather everyone around and escape. But they can't get all of Lynn's officers, so it's only the main characters who make it out, and we'll get to the result of that in a second. But like I was saying at the start, to me this is Asami's biggest moment, because there's very few scenes in the series where like the plot kind of hinges upon something Asami like says or does, and I really like this one, because even though I think there was maybe options to make it better and lead to bigger moments for Asami while still roughly keeping things similar, it's still a great moment because it shows, I suppose, that the character is kind of truly good. That you wouldn't have, like, been too disappointed with her as a character if she had sided with her father, because he is the only one left, and that this would be going against so much else. She'd be losing the kind of wealthy lifestyle, and moving away from her father, her parents. It's a huge decision that she makes to actually side with friends that she hasn't known that long, because in her mind this is the right thing to do. That she doesn't lean into, well, a few things happened to me, so I hate all benders and will make this decision. She disagrees with that, and it definitely plays back on the idea of, like, it is almost surprising that Hiroshi didn't almost brainwash her from the point at which he joined the Equalists to make her feel the same way that he did. The fact that he actually kept her out of this, hoping that it would be much later on that he'd only have to reveal it, is very, very interesting, and I'm surprised they maybe didn't reference that maybe in the book 4 stuff later on, but it's still very, very interesting to consider that it shows that, like, he still cares about his family, and that he's kind of like, I'll go down that path of hatred, and then when the time comes I'll try to bring her with me. So interesting to add like a little bit of nuance to him, that he's not just completely gone, he's not just like absolutely terrible, but you still are frustrated by his like last ditch attempt to force her to hate benders. So I'm a huge fan of this scene, and like I said, I think it's Asami's best moment in like the entire show, because it's one of the few ones where she gets to be the spotlight and centerpiece of a scene. But what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, she definitely is spotlight, and like you said, it does really sort of hinge on her decision, which, she's part of the group, so you might sort of think that maybe she might have got more moments of that, but she really didn't overall. She definitely helps, in a huge way towards, the conflicts in a couple of the other seasons and stuff like that. But this one, it really is on her. And yeah, I mean, I guess, I don't know, he definitely could have, geared her sort of like personality and her growth towards, more hating towards benders, but maybe that wouldn't have helped in terms of like keeping things under wrap. Like, he's an adult, he can sort of hide those things, which clearly he did. Maybe as a younger child, that might not have been something as well as she might have been adept at doing. Maybe that's sort of his reasoning for not sort of bringing her into it, or maybe it is just sort of like you said, that, he still cares deep down for her and her general well-being, which, what we see later on in season 4 and stuff like that, generally would lead us towards believing that. Although I wonder if that's something that they had really, sort of decided on, considering, the production and development of the series overall. But who knows? Maybe it was just sort of good foresight on their end. But I think in terms of like the scene and her decision, it definitely works really well. The whole idea that they sort of like do the rack focus from the gauntlet to her face, and the whole like sort of you can't really tell where her emotions sort of lie. I think, that's everything that they were sort of going for in this scene, and it works really well.
So, yeah, in the aftermath of this, we just get that Lynn is injured. She says she's going to resign. Tenzin thinks she's giving up, but she says no. I'm still going to fight. She wants to get her officers back. That's her focus. But she's going to do it outside the law. And then we also get a scene with Mako apologizing to Korra for being, I suppose, too harsh with her about, sticking to her guns on something she actually believed in. And they just agree that, okay, they're all going to go live at the air temple, referencing the opening scene of the episode, except now Asami also needs a place to live. And then, in a very nice moment to resolve any sort of romantic tensions here as well, Korra does say to Mako that Asami will need you now more than ever. So it's her kind of accepting that, like, okay, this is a terrible thing that Asami has just gone through. You are now like the closest person to her in the world right now. You need to be with her. She needs you at this point. And I like that kind of Korra is mature enough to realize that and put any sort of like feelings aside for now. So very mature moment from Korra at the end. And again, there's no big deal made about like told you so or anything like that, because I think Mako's sort of reasonable about like no one would have thought that like this is a kind of thing that could have actually happened. It's like crazy to even consider. And they're all just like sad that it's come to this, that this is the way it actually worked out, rather than being happy or sad about they're being right or wrong. So again, there's a lot of things that Korra does like this, where it seems like this is really, really intense drama. How are they going to get through this? But then the characters just talk and communicate properly, and they come to like nice, reasonable conclusions. And I think this is pretty solid stuff overall here. But it definitely also sets the stage, even though Tarlok's not in this episode, for he's kind of gotten what he wants, which is Lin has resigned, but we don't really know what he needed Lin set aside to do. So now suddenly Tarlok is going to jump into the spotlight in the next episode. So a lot of cool things to reflect on with this one. But what are your thoughts on these final scenes?
Yeah, no, I think at this point, everyone's sort of just completely, confused and sad and upset about how this whole situation has gone down. It's definitely, there was no real win to this situation. Like, if he's being accused of this and it actually becomes true, then it doesn't work out well. And even if it wasn't true, it still wouldn't have worked out well in terms of like their relationships and how they go forward with everything. So there really was no sort of like best case scenario in this situation, which is pretty much what everyone seems to be feeling at this point. And Lynn being sort of like upended in this whole situation and having to sort of, break apart from what she's, pretty much as like seen as her whole life up until this point, just makes that side of the situation, pretty sad. But, you get to see that she's actually going to like do something. She's not just going to sit by, which I think is really good point of her character overall. And yeah, no, it just seems like a lot of them are being, pretty or as mature as they can be in this situation. Like there's really no way to sort of like combat this, overall. So I think, or being mature in a situation, which is something that I think a lot of times her character gets knocked at for not being as much. It's definitely a nice thing to see at this point in time.
Mm-hmm. And then, yeah, with the Lin thing, that I like that this is like a reference to what Tenzin said, and is that like you're actually quite similar to her, and this is Lin suddenly realizing that she's going to have to do a little bit of vigilante stuff, which she obviously gave out to Korra for in the first episode. So I like that comparison. Only other scene from earlier on that I don't think we talked about, I think you referenced it once, is just the Korra and Tano scene, which I think is actually quite good, because you do get to see like a different side of Tano when he's not just the villainous pro-bender who injures people and cheats. And you see that this is what someone whose bending is important, what they're like when they've lost it and can't get it back. And that he mentions he's been to healers and none of them can do anything for him, and he is just a wreck, as we see him here, I suppose, giving his report on what happened at the police station, and that he just wants Korra to get him on for him too. And I like that he sort of realizes that, like, oh, like, I don't need to be so antagonistic towards Korra, she's the Avatar, this is her job, and this is what's going to happen. And then there's this slight moment of like hope that he's going to get back on track when he says the Avatar right as he leaves. So I thought this was kind of a well acted scene to just give a little bit more nuance to Tano as a character, and I like that they included this to show like an aftermath of someone losing their bending as well. So what are your thoughts on the Tano scene?
Yeah, no, I think the reaction to the bending, the loss of your bending, how integral it is to your character or to your person, it definitely comes across in the scene. Just the whole idea of being, like you said, to the best healers, and he's apparently giving some sort of like report of the situation. Yeah, it definitely adds to the emphasis of what Amon's able to do. And of course, just the whole idea that, he showed that power off in like the largest stage that the city has to offer. Just adds to the intrigue, the fear, the power that he has or is, developing over the city.
Mm-hmm. And that brings us into our last episode review for this week, and that is going back to Avatar 110 Jet. So this is one of those ones where like 109 I think is one of the weaker episodes. I think 110 is like a solid episode. I still don't think it's one of the best from the season, but it helps that we have like a much more interesting and kind of multi-dimensional character compared to say like the pirates are just the pirates. Jet is absolutely the highlight of this episode as a character, and there's a reason he comes back and has like a lot of emotional kind of plot points around him, and it's because they present a lot of them here, and I think they do a great job, I think, with the way they choose to bring him back. My issues with this episode are probably more that to sort of get the dynamic you need to get, it involves, I think, characterizing some of the characters a little bit weirdly, in that you have to have Katara and Aang just be like, absolutely obsessed with Jet to the point where they don't respect Sokka much anymore. And it's just, we were talking about how well the nuance was in the Korra episode over, again, some dramatic situations. This is where the nuance maybe isn't quite there, where they're just like, this guy's great, Sokka, you're an idiot, we don't care about you. And it's just a little frustrating that you feel so bad for Sokka, which is good, but it's because you have to have Katara and Aang feel a little bit sort of silly throughout the episode, and it's like, finally your eyes have been opened when they finally realize the error of their ways. But there's a decent amount to get to in this one. So what are your initial thoughts on Jet?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I like the episode overall. I think it does some interesting things in terms of like the overall, war that's going on and seeing how it's affecting people directly. And we get to, encounter other characters who have been directly affected by the war, losing family members and everything like that. So I like it from that aspect. It does, I do get the idea that, Katara and Aang seem a little bit out of character, or maybe a lot out of character, depending on your perspective. I think they try to play Katara's angle on this in terms of the whole relationship and the crush and everything. So I guess, you can kind of see the focus from that aspect. But Aang here, I guess, you're just trying to like put him along the side here that, he really doesn't have the maturity enough to sort of understand the situations that are going on. Maybe that's the whole idea of him just being like a goofy kid is what they say in the beginning here. So I don't know. It definitely has some interesting moments here, and the battles are pretty cool as well. But there are some things that you sort of question, I guess, a little bit more so than you might have thought of.
Yeah, like I think for me, without getting into it too much right now, it's just I almost wish they had it be like, okay, I get it because of the kind of crush, kind of romance dynamic, why Katara kind of feels the way she does. I think with Aang, it's a little bit forced because I feel they would have done a little bit of a jealousy angle with him seeing how close Katara and Jet are, which is kind of what we kind of see later on with these type of situations. So it feels a bit weird that Aang is kind of oblivious to this kind of Katara Jet like kind of romance thing, that she has kind of feelings for him to some degree. And I kind of like think would have created a bit of a better dynamic, that say it's Aang and Sokka having to try and like convince Katara, who's very involved with the freedom fighters, about what's going on. I think that would reflect better on why Katara, when Jet appears later on, still feels so like almost embarrassed about this situation, that she feels she made a fool of herself, like not trusting Sokka or Aang. Whereas like in a way, because Aang is involved, it maybe doesn't make it feel as big. But you know, we'll get into this here. So the setup for the episode is on this idea of, we introduce like Sokka's instincts, and the opening scene is his instincts getting them into trouble. He doesn't want them to fly because the Fire Nation will see them, but while they're walking, they walk into a firebender camp and have to be saved by Jet and the freedom fighters. So this immediately has Katara and Aang like against Sokka's instincts, because one thing went wrong, even though he's been sort of planning their trips up to now and has been usually quite right, and his suggestion here was actually logical and reasonable to some degree. It just happened to not quite go right. And it's fine, like it makes sense to a certain degree, but it's very basic that this is effectively what means they're not going to believe Sokka for the rest of the episode. And you see the difference in like nuance between this and the Korra episode, I think, quite clearly. But what are your thoughts on this opening episode of like that theme of like trusting Sokka's instincts or not?
Yeah, I mean, they definitely play it up for a lot of laughs, at least here initially, just sort of, them walking and Aang, not really being a fan of it as much. But yeah, I mean, I think, like you said, it does have some logic behind it, being able to sort of like, maybe it's not best to be able to be seen, or maybe there's, other techniques that you can do when you're flying with Appa in order to like cover up, his appearance in the skies, because we do see later on in the series that becomes a point. Of course, there's more of it being sort of like a tracking trail with the fur and everything, but, Sokka's point are valid. It's a little bit too early for his instincts to sort of be fully realized at this point. But yeah, no, the idea that they're walking straight into this firebender, Fire Nation sort of like encampment here just sort of doesn't help, any sort of at least initial trust in the situation here, which, I think, for them being like a newly formed group here and him trying to sort of like play it up like he's going to be the leader because he's the older one and he's the warrior with like the experience and everything like that. I think it it kind of works in terms of like what they're going for, even if it is sort of more along the lines of like a surface level issue that pretty much gets resolved pretty quickly.
Yeah, and so we do immediately meet Jet and the freedom fighters. So we get Jet, Smellerbee, Longshot, Pipsqueak, the Duke, and Sneers. So I think it's very interesting, like the two Avatar episodes we've done back to back, in that we effectively do have two groups of characters who are all sort of non-benders, sort of their skill sets are kind of different martial arts, different weapons. And one group stands out like a million times more interesting than the other. And that is that the freedom fighters are like, I think, vastly more interesting than the pirates. And then part of that is that, like, in a show like this, of course, the group that is closer in age to Team Avatar is just, I think, naturally going to be more interesting. But Jet is just so much, like, cooler, interesting of a character than the pirate leader, pirate captain. And the designs are different, of like how small the Duke is, how big Pipsqueak is. You've got the archer who doesn't speak. Smellerbee with the knives and stuff, the different weapons, and then like even Sneers, who is probably the least important here, but actually gets some development in the comics, is actually a somewhat interesting character. So again, we kind of have talked about the sort of hits and misses along the way, and it's been mostly hits. Maybe sort of like Haru is maybe not the most interesting character, but he's fine. They got it right here, and then they did a great job as time went on of like, okay, Smellerbee and Longshot also get some development later on. the Duke more so than Pipsqueak as when they come back, I think, and then Sneers in the comics. So, what are your thoughts on the group here, and why do these work where maybe other minor characters have failed?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know, it seems like they just have a lot more personality. Like, they all, like you said, they all are unique. They all have their own sort of abilities. And, the pirates, they all had, a lot of them had their own sort of unique abilities. Like the whole idea with like the smoke screen, you would think that that would like stand out in terms of like techniques. Like, the whole idea of like, ninjas and that whole idea and smoke screens, that's sort of like a key thing in like kids cartoons. But no, this group here, with their all the different sort of archetypes that they have, which they're not really that in depth or anything like that. Like it's not like there's so much depth into the characters, and a lot of them, some of them don't even get any depth added to them until you get later on in other sort of forms of media. But I think mainly it's it might more so just be because of the strength of Jet and his character, and just sort of how charismatic he seems to be in terms of the whole group overall. You get to see later on where he's actually sort of interacting with the group, and you can clearly see the leader contrast that they're trying to have between him and Sokka here. Maybe it's just because he's a little bit older, but not too old that you can't sort of like relate to him as a character. And, I'm sure part of it's just part of his abilities, and the fact that he's able to sort of like be pretty proficient in battle as well probably helps just as much. And you get to see more of that in this episode than you do get to see with like the pirates, and say like the captain who, we mentioned was pretty good. Like he, was able to go up against Zuko. But, there's not as much of a focus on that. So maybe that's part of the reason why he seems to stand out that much more, even before we get to see him, reappear in the series.
Yeah, and they do good stuff earlier on. That like it's pretty clear that like they straight away present the idea. Katara immediately has a crush on Jet. Aang just thinks Jet is super cool. Very quickly they do introduce the concept of the blasting jelly that's like in the opening scene, which comes into play later on. They have a cool hideout in the trees, which also I think adds to it. There's like very cool base, and just the kind of in a way group backstory for them of like it's basically a group of kids orphaned by the Fire Nation. They all have some story or another, in that like we know Jets is later is revealed to be the rough rhinos who attacked his village and led to him being in this situation. They actually mention like the Duke. They just found him, and according to the Duke, like he never even knew his parents. So that's a pretty like crazy backstory as well. And that works here because that's what this episode plays with on its most kind of serious point, is these kids who have similar, backstories to most of our characters, in that like obviously Katara and Sokka lost their mother to the Fire Nation. Aang lost all of his people to the Fire Nation. They have lost their parents to their to the Fire Nation. So it's an episode in a way similar to the Asami, Hiroshi, Bender hate Bender dynamic here. It's the should you hate the Fire Nation as a whole because one member of that nation or a group from that nation did something that hurt you, and that's what they play on throughout this whole episode. And it seems to be going okay up until right at the end of Jet's quite good speech. He's like, no, they're dead wrong, and they like zoom in on his face. The color changes, and it's like very subtle here episode with this of like, I see what you're going for straight away. And it's good sometimes to be that blunt with it. But what were your thoughts on this, of like what they do here when they introduce everyone, the backstories for everyone, and then the shift in Jet's speech right at the end?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like this whole village is like the extreme version of what Sokka and Katara sort of went through, which I guess is more along the lines of what Aang went through, because his whole nation is gone right here. But this is sort of like the extreme cases where the kids have to support themselves entirely, versus Sokka and Katara. They at least had their grandmother and they had their whole village, even though their village was more or less decimated at the point there, and all of the men are gone from the village as well. But just having that little bit of support, I guess, let them to be a little bit more even keeled than sort of Jet and his sort of extremist views that he has in this episode here, which you definitely get across at the end of the speech that dead wrong means that something really bad, really extreme is going to happen later on. And just the next scene, you get to see sort of how far he's willing to go in these sort of situations.
And you begin to see here that like Jet is even like a little bit kind of manipulative, because I think he can see straight away that like, oh yeah, like Aang and Katara both like love me, like I they're completely on my side, but he's aware that Sokka isn't quite buying into it just yet, and is kind of like, oh yeah, and Sokka, like I have a mission like that exactly needs you, and Sokka does want to prove himself. He goes ahead with it, and he proves himself. He does the kind of trick with the knife in the tree that even Jet's kind of quite impressed with. But this is the kind of key moment in the episode. It's that there's one person coming, they're waiting for the ambush, and it's an elderly Fire Nation man, and Sokka's like, oh yeah, no problem, just let him pass, it's just an old man. But the freedom fighters just jump down and ambush him, and Sokka has to stop Jet from, like, it looks like full force kicking the old man in the face if he didn't block him from doing that. And this is where it becomes really clear. Jet just is like, Fire Nation equals bad, and they they hurt the Fire Nation, and that's how heavy their kind of vengeance is. And it's, I think it's somewhat clear from like some scenes later on with like the Duke that, unlike in a way Hiroshi to Asami, Jet has been trying to get them all to agree with him on this point, and some of them do. In that, like, Smellerbee seems to be fully on board with him here. The fact that Longshot still like fires the arrow that makes the explosion at the end of the episode. He's managed to convince a lot of the other kids to agree with him on the idea of like all the Fire Nation is bad. So I think this scene is super effective at presenting like the theme of the episode really, really well. And just that idea that like, yes, Sokka also has reason to dislike the Fire Nation, but understands his issue is not with this Fire Nation man, or even maybe anyone from that village. And just that distinction is like kind of important to kind of get across. But what were your thoughts on this scene?
Yeah, no, I think this is a really good point for Sokka and his character, because I think, maybe a little bit earlier on in a couple earlier episodes, I don't know if he would have gone as far as, assaulting this random Fire Nation man, but, I think he might have been more inclined towards the idea that, more of the Fire Nation is bad than it is good. So, that shows some growth in Sokka's character here. But yeah, no, Jet definitely has, the group sort of on this idea that the Fire Nation is no good, which, understandably, the situation that all these kids have been put in, doesn't seem like it's ideal. And, they've been going at this for, who knows how long at this point. But it's enough that, most of the group, even if they question it a little bit, they have more faith in what Jet's able to do and able to overcome than any, personal ideas that they have that, something might be a little bit off in this sort of situation. But you can see that Sokka at this point, definitely is not on board. He's seen too much and is ready to just bounce at this point.
Mm-hmm. And that leads into a very interesting point when they get back of like Jet tries to again make it out that, Sokka's got one wrong again, because actually this old man was an assassin. He had this poison knife that Jet just kind of whips out. And Sokka's like, I didn't see a poison knife. And by the end of the episode, it becomes very clear that, no, Sokka was right here. That Jet, I'm assuming the knife was one of Smellerbee's, because I think one of Smellerbee's skills is knives, and I think poison knives specifically. So it was just, they're basically highlighting that and trying to frame the man to make it out like, no, we're not wrong, Sokka, you were wrong here. And it's a relatively kind of subtle plot point, but I kind of like that they executed on it quite well here, and that it comes back that the group, the village of Fire Nation people don't believe the Water Tribe boy who comes to warn them, except for the fact that Sokka saved this man from a beating, basically. So, um, in that sense, like there's some really good stuff in this episode. I do think it's just let down by the characterization of Aang and Katara. But what were your thoughts on the whole dynamic with the poison knife and sort of in a way Jet trying to like defame Sokka?
Yeah, I don't know how I feel about that one. I mean, maybe it seems a little bit heavy-handed. I mean, I don't know. They bring up earlier in the episode, right, that like, the Fire Nation really wants to get their hands on Jet, and that's what one of the other freedom fighters mentions. And I don't know. I don't know if there's enough quite to make me think that that would be so important that that would be like an instant thing that would be like, oh, okay, yeah, this is definitely something that's going to happen. I don't know, maybe that seems a little bit too heavy-handed, or maybe I'm not reading into it enough. But I think in terms of like getting the point across towards Katara and Aang, Katara is like over infatuated at this point, so I don't think there would have been much that needed at that point. I think even without the poison, the knife itself probably would have worked for her. And Aang, I don't know. I mean, he seems like he's just sort of like doing, I don't know, maybe the more airbender thing and just sort of going with the flow at this point here, and just sort of thinks Jet is just too cool not to be wrong in this sort of situation. Aang just seems to be really, involved with the whole idea of, the, where they're at, how they're working, how, there's something that Jet needs them for later on. So yeah, no, I don't know. It's just, sometimes it feels like it's a bit much, but, it's pushing things forward.
Yeah, the whole thing about like Jet making that like he's like one of the Fire Nation's most wanted. I think he's maybe getting there, and that like if he had actually gone through with this, he probably would have been. But I did get the impression that like that's part of like him as the charismatic leader, that he's making it out that like they've done all these small little things that have inconvenienced the Fire Nation, but it's not enough to make them like hunt him down like he's like the worst thing to ever happen to the Fire Nation. And it's just a thing that his people will believe, that like, oh, they're sending assassins after me, when they're not actually. So it's just sort of in a way like some of the lies that he feels he needs to kind of hold to keep everyone on his side. That's how kind of far down this path that he actually is. So yeah, this is where we sort of learn about the plan, which is that Jet wants to fill the reservoir, blow up the dam, and basically drown an entire village of people just because they're Fire Nation people in the Earth Kingdom. And I think Sokka even pointed out that like innocent people will die, even children, and Jet's just like sacrifices need to be made in war. So it's very like over the top and extreme, but for this character, knowing where the character goes, I don't mind it too much, because I think it actually works, because they do this in like a few cases. Like it's a sort of similar thing to Hama, where they sort of show that like the Fire Nation in what they do hurts people so badly that they make them into villains, and that Jet's a victim of the Fire Nation, but he's so badly affected by that he goes down way too far down the path of revenge, and it turns him into this character who is not particularly likable. So I like that nuance, even if it's maybe a tad heavy-handed. But it mainly is because I think we see the redemption in death kind of done well when we get to season 2. But what are your thoughts on the plan coming out here? Drown the town.
Yeah, no, it definitely seems very sort of like extreme, which, is supposed to be the point, right? Just to show you how far he's willing to go for his ideals, and how he's able to rope in all the other, kids into his plan, even if there are some hesitations later on. His views here are pretty skewed, which, maybe there's, some understanding for that, some bias that can work towards this end. But, the idea that he's doesn't seem to even be considering anything else. I think they make a note of that later on, that, he sees this as like the sort of the only way, like there's no other, way that, them as their group could like liberate this town, as he sort of tries to say, to sort of like justify what he's actually doing here. It pretty much shows that he's like pretty far gone, at least in terms of, realizing what he's actually doing.
From here, we just get scenes of like, he obviously has Sokka taken away. He lies to Katara and Katara and Aang about like what Sokka has or hasn't said, and he gets them to fill the dam for like other reasons, and like he's obviously lying to them as well. There's a few fun scenes here. A little sort of continuity point here of Katara says, "I've never used bending on water I can't see," but she bent the water out of Aang's lungs in 104. Now, I don't know if there's a slight distinction between like, oh, I know there's water and it's in Aang's lungs, that's why he's in this state, versus I'm just trying to bend water out of this hole, who knows how far down it goes. There probably is a distinction, but it stood out to me in reflection that this is what's happening here. So Sokka escapes. Katara and Aang, after they do that mission, realize later what Jet is doing. Jet attacks Aang, and we get this really, really nicely animated fight between Aang and Jet in the trees. It's like Jet's playground. He's so agile. He knows exactly what he's doing. And even though Aang is agile, he's maybe not used to fighting in the trees here. So Jet actually kind of gets the victory in this fight, even though Aang puts up a pretty good fight. But as they land on the ground, Katara slams Jet into a tree with water and freezes him to the tree. And we get the important point for later on in like season 2. She really gets across the point of like, I am hurt that you broke my trust. I had so much faith in you and you ruined it all. And this comes up later on when they meet again. So right as this happens, the dam explodes. It looks like everything's going terribly. Sokka shows up and it's revealed that he warned the villagers. They got out. No one died. The old man vouched for Sokka. It all comes together. And we end with a nice line from Sokka that Jet became the traitor when he stopped protecting innocent people. That if that's what he was about, if that's what the group was about, that, in a way, unfortunately, in a way, involves also sometimes protecting Fire Nation people if they are also innocent. So very nice line from Sokka showing like that he has the right sort of distinction in his mind about what he's fighting for in the war. And it's a nice ending to the episode, because at this point, like, when the characters finally realize that they were in the wrong, the emotions are there and it's quite well done. So I think it's just literally some stuff right at the start that kind of holds back this episode for me. But otherwise, like, I think it's a strong ending. But what are your thoughts on these final sequences here?
Yeah, I think, the resolution towards the conflict here, you definitely get to see, a more broad view of, I guess, sort of the war and how they're viewing themselves in it, and the battles that they have to take, and sort of the sides that they have to choose. It's becoming a bit more nuanced in the fact that, not everyone that's in one nation or another nation is going towards, this sort of idea, and that, the sacrifices that you have to make, maybe there might be a potentially better way of doing about things. Like, maybe if they were to sort of like cut off more of the supply lines, or, actually, interact with the people actually there, maybe they would have realized that maybe this wasn't sort of the best way to go about it. But, this is sort of the path that they chose to go on. And, the whole idea of seeing Aang versus Jet, like you mentioned, that definitely was sort of like the highlight of this episode. And I think that, gets mentioned a lot in the early seasons, or the early episodes, as like one of the highlight moments here. You actually get to see someone who, they have like, almost every advantage to the point where they can, pretty much go toe to toe with Aang. Granted, Aang's not necessarily trying to hurt Jet in sort of like the worst way possible or anything like that. Although if he were to get knocked off of, the trees up high, like he would have had a hard time recovering from that if he went straight to the ground. But, Jet has quite the advantage knowing, how to maneuver and his weapons and everything like that. So even without, sort of being able to know exactly how to counter Aang, he does pretty well, like to the point where he's pretty much, has the upper hand and is able to destroy the glider enough so that Aang can't actually use it, at this current point in time here. But, there's other people in play here that actually sort of wins them the fight in the end here. But yeah, no, it's definitely a pretty strong, I guess, sort of ending to this episode with the battle to the actual reveal of what actually happened in the village with Sokka.
And then my final point is just more about kind of where things go from here, is that we learn in like Laogai, I believe, that the people who Jet actually sort of should be sort of aiming his intent at is the rough rhinos, and he dies before he ever gets a chance to do that, and it never really comes up again. And it really makes me kind of wish we'd almost got something like that, because I think the freedom fighters versus the rough rhinos would be a great fight, because they're both sort of like, in a way, like ragtag groups of like specialists. But obviously there's benders on the rough rhino side of things, and then you have the heavy emotion of these are the people who directly did it to Jet. I've always found that to be a very interesting kind of thing, that we never really come back around to the rough rhinos did this, especially like when some of the comics are maybe placing them in more of like a comedic role. It kind of feels like we need to come back to this a little bit. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that? That, the rough rhinos are kind of interlinked with the freedom fighters, but we never see it properly come into play outside of just the backstory connection.
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely something there to be explored if they ever really wanted to go for it. I mean, it's always the thing, like, how much would they really delve into sort of like a minor character's backstory and his involvement in the series overall, especially since he's no longer around at this point. So, where's quite the value? But I think, the Rough Rhinos themselves, as when we do get to those episodes, is quite an interesting group, just in terms of like their tactics and who they have as part of their group. So it definitely would have been a pretty interesting, like, group on group battle, especially since one side does have, a relatively strong, firebender. How would, our group here, combat that, and I don't know, maybe some more sort of like sneaky type of ways or something like that. So there definitely would have been, something there to explore, just sort of, the Rough Rhinos' actual history, maybe when they were more sort of like vicious than sort of the sort of mellowed out version that we see more often than not recently.
And so, yeah, that is the end of our reviews for this episode. Next time we have a podcast, we'll be doing another 3 episodes. The grouping is going to be for Korra, just K108, When Extremes Meet. A very, very good episode. And then a very interesting duo of episodes for Avatar. The Great Divide, 111, and The Storm, 112. So very much the sort of like, in a way, like the best and worst of the season to some extent. But all 3 episodes are actually super interesting to discuss, because like I think The Great Divide, even though it's like not one of the better episodes, is still super, super interesting to discuss, and it's so underappreciated that every time you look at it and discuss it, you realize that like, oh yeah, there's a lot of cool ideas in this that I'm surprised I never went back to. And then 108 and 112 are great, in my opinion. Well, what are your thoughts on this grouping of episodes?
Yeah, it's funny because, yeah, the Great Divide does get sort of knocked on so much. And I think in more recent times, with more of the, like, other media that's come out, we've seen, like, more of the importance of the ideas that were actually in this episode. So I think coming back to it might be interesting just to see, what we view on it now with all the additional media that we have. But yeah, no, the Storm has always been a good one. And then, yeah, 108 for Korra, I think that's always been one that people mention is pretty, interesting and fun, just because we get to see like the actual core group actually working together.
Yeah, and also like one of the biggest like shock reveals in like franchise history as well at the end. So that's going to be very fun to discuss. So that'll be on the next podcast. And yeah, beyond that, like obviously we've got the build up to San Diego Comic Con, which might actually be interesting this year, given what's the news we talked about this time out. And of course, in around the same time, Dawn of Yang Chen is going to be coming out. So we're still probably going to have probably one or two podcasts before we get to either of those two big events. So we should be, getting towards the end of Korra by the time some of that stuff hits. Korra Book 1. But yeah, other than that, that's been episode 246 of the Avatar Online podcast. It's been myself and Greg. Thanks for listening, and bye.
Bye bye.